Ways and Means Committee on the IRS's tax-exempt application review process. You see him at the table there. This coming after revelations that the agency targeted certain political groups applying for tax-exempt status. Mr. Werfel took over as acting IRS commissioner last month, following the resignation of prior acting commissioner Stephen Miller. This is live coverage now on C-SPAN 3.
Absolutely. Hey, you got a soccer ball? All right, great. All right. Who's got chewing gum? Chewing gum the same time? Yeah.
Okay. We all set? You ready?
Yeah, do you... The committee will come to order. Good morning. It's been 6 weeks since the IRS first revealed that they were purposefully targeting conservative-leaning organizations. And this week, additional IRS documents revealed that the term progressive, along with others, were also included on the Be on the Lookout list, or the BOLO. And I want to make one thing clear. No taxpayer, regardless of political affiliation, should be unfairly targeted. It's wrong, and this committee is working to ensure that it will never happen again. The committee's welcomed all groups that feel they've been targeted for extra scrutiny to come forward, and I urge them to do so. So far, the evidence only shows conservatives being systematically targeted by the IRS, not just flagged through the BOLO, but actually targeted. These Americans consistently had their applications delayed for nearly 3 years, were asked intrusive and inappropriate questions, had their donor information leaked, and were even threatened by the IRS with additional taxes. But as I've long said, we're in the early stages of this investigation, and as we gather the facts, we'll follow those facts wherever they lead. Again, if there are any additional groups of any political affiliation that feel they were mistreated, I urge them to come forward and share their story. From what we've already learned, it's clear that the IRS is a broken agency that needs to answer to the American people. Mr. Werfel, in the interest of accountability and at the discretion of Treasury Secretary Liu, you spearheaded a 30-day review of the practice of discriminating against conservative groups. Unfortunately, while I'm aware this is an initial report, it fails to deliver the accountability the American people deserve. This report doesn't answer even the most basic, significant questions. Who started this practice? Why has it been allowed to continue for so long? How widespread was it? In fact, this report suggests that you haven't even asked anyone those questions. Additionally, the report fails to address some of the most egregious offenses by the IRS. I'm specifically talking about the intentional leaking of confidential taxpayer information and the IRS threatening conservative donors with additional taxes. The review notes that it's important that the Inspector General continues to identify inappropriate actions, but where is the internal oversight? Where are the checks to prevent this behavior in the first place? How will the IRS learn from these inexcusable actions and provide the American taxpayer with real proof and evidence that it will not happen again. It will be necessary to provide concrete reforms and assurances to begin rebuilding the trust this agency has lost with the American people. A glaring recommendation in this report is that Congress fulfill the agency's budget request of an additional $1 billion. And frankly, it's insulting to taxpayers that the IRS would ask for an additional $1 billion right after we find out that the IRS was targeting taxpayers for their beliefs, after they spent millions of taxpayer dollars on frivolous conferences, produced completely useless videos, and put expensive dinners and alcohol on IRS credit cards. And Mr. Werfel, let me be clear, until the IRS proves that it can responsibly manage its current funds, the IRS will not see one more dime in taxpayer funding. We need real reforms, and they must be implemented so the American people can have a restored faith that they have a government that works for them, not against them. That begins with instituting long-term and meaningful changes. Changes to both how the agency operates and to the tax code that the agency is trying to enforce. And as I've stated before, I often hear from constituents in Michigan about their fear of being audited by the IRS. That fear used to stem from the fact that the tax code was so complicated. Nobody really knew what was in it, or if they had filed their taxes correctly. Even when people paid someone else to do their taxes, they'd sign their return not really knowing what was in it and hoping the preparer got it right. And that is something this committee must and will fix. However, today Americans fear an audit, not just because the tax code is too complex, but because we have an agency that is out of control. We have managers in Washington sitting on cases for years, directing intrusive and inappropriate questions to be asked, and after a month-long internal review, what you tell this committee is that a few people have been removed from their old jobs, but you cannot even assure us that they have been removed from the agency. It's my understanding that they either continue to be paid or are receiving full retirement benefits. And on top of those salaries and benefits, those employees have received over $250,000 in bonuses over the last few years. And you've not identified any structural changes within the IRS that would prevent these abuses of power from happening again. If there is anything this report shows, it's just how much more work must be done. Congress will continue the investigation into the IRS's actions and get to the bottom of this so we can ensure that no American is targeted again. And with that, I yield to Mr. Levin for the purposes of his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Werfel. I'll go over my opening statement in just a moment. I want to urge you, you've heard the opening statement of the chairman. I know you mostly have been kind of a technician all your years in both the Bush administration and in this administration. I hope, though, that you will, if I might suggest, respond very vigorously when statements are made. I hope you will actively report on what you have done during your first 30 days. Where mistakes have been made by the Internal Revenue Service, we on the Democratic side have been very, very clear. When inappropriate criteria were used, we were among the first to say that those who were in charge in the IRS should be relieved of their duties. So I hope you'll respond very actively and vigorously to all the questions. I think we need to get the facts and not innuendos. We are here today to learn about the corrective action that the IRS has taken to address mismanagement and processing of tax-exempt applications. So, Mr. Werfel, a welcome to the Ways and Means Committee. I'm not sure how warm it is, but welcome. I'm glad to see in your 30-day report that you have instituted management changes that span the entire IRS management chain as needed. I see from your report that these changes reach into the exempt organization division, indeed as necessary, and the team responsible for determinations on applications for tax-exempt status. We are also interested in your recommendations for obtaining greater effectiveness within the IRS with respect to better early warning systems and risk management. We look forward to hearing your testimony on your new enterprise risk management program, which I understand will improve IRS accountability and responsiveness to stakeholders, including this Congress. As your report makes clear, there was clear mismanagement on the part of the IRS Exempt Organizations Division in processing these tax exemption applications. The additional assessment and plan of action appear to be a solid roadmap to addressing the problems, and we encourage you, as I said at the beginning, to actively, to vigorously, to completely pursuing this plan. But for our committee, which launched this investigation on a bipartisan basis, the backdrop for today's hearing is the troubling new information that has come to light about the report issued by the Treasury Inspector General of Tax Administration. This week, we learned for the first time the three key items. One, the screening list used by the IRS included the term progressives. Two, progressive groups were among the 298 applications that TIGTA reviewed in their audit and received heightened scrutiny. And three, the Inspector General did not research how the term progressives was added to the screening list or how those cases were handled by a different group of specialists in the IRS. The failure of the IG's audit to acknowledge these facts is a fundamental flaw in the foundation of the investigation and the public's perception of this issue. I wrote to the IG and asked him to explain these omissions. And all committee Democrats have asked you, Mr. Chairman, today that you ask Mr. George to return to the committee to provide the appropriate context for his report and answer questions under oath regarding all of these matters. Our committee, in its oversight role, has an obligation to fully understand the manner in which the IG conducted his audit and at what direction. Deeply troubling is that when asked about the new information that has come to light, the Treasury IG office initially said in media reports, and I quote, that our audit report answered questions it was asked to address, end of quotes, and that the House Oversight Committee Chairman Darrell Issa had specifically requested that investigators, in quotes, narrowly focus on Tea Party organizations. We asked TIGTA about this in a letter, and it responded in quotes that many of the press reports are not accurate. If these or some of the reports were accurate, TIGTA's initial explanation of the scope of the audit is inconsistent with the description of the IG's audit work in the 2013 audit plan and the stated objective on the first page of the May 14, 2013 audit report. The stated objective was, and I quote, to determine whether allegations were founded that the IRS, one, targeted specific groups applying for tax-exempt status, two, delayed processing of targeting groups' applications, and three, requested unnecessary information from targeted groups. The IG's failure to be forthcoming in the audit and at congressional hearings, even when asked directly if there was a screening list for progressive, and whether progressive groups were included among the 298 applications reviewed by TIGTA, has contributed to the distortion of the entire investigation, including use of innuendo and totally unsubstantiated assertions of White House involvement. Democrats have condemned the singling out of Tea Party by name. I hope our colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle will now join us in condemning the use of the term progressives on the screening lists and the failure of the IG to be forthcoming with this and other congressional committees. We have also been supportive of letting the facts lead where they may. None of us, including the acting IRS commissioner, can describe how an application was processed once it was screened. I caution my colleagues from jumping to conclusions until we know all the facts. Searching for the facts is the only way we are going to get back on the course that I hope is our mutual goal, the fixing of the problems, all of the problems at the IRS, and restoring the trust of the American people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Now I'd like to introduce our witness, Mr. Daniel Werfel, Principal Deputy Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service. Thank you, Mr. Werfel, for being with us today. The committee has received your report, and it will be made part of the formal hearing record. You will have 5 minutes for your oral remarks. You're now recognized.
Chairman Camp, Ranking Member Levin, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the progress we have made thus far in charting a path forward for the IRS and what we hope to accomplish in the future. The report we released on Monday describes a number of important findings, aggressive actions, and next steps for the IRS. The problems with the 501c4 application process that were uncovered by the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration have created significant concerns for taxpayers, and it is incumbent upon us to take swift action to ensure accountability, fix the problems that occurred, and thoroughly examine other aspects of IRS operations. Over the past month, an ongoing review of the events described in the TIGTA report has shed further light on the management failures that occurred within the IRS and the causes of those failures. There was insufficient action by IRS leaders to identify, prevent, address, and disclose the problems that emerged with the review of applications for tax-exempt status. Our report outlines management deficiencies and the steps that must be taken to correct them. Importantly, the report does not provide a complete and final set of answers. Instead, it offers an initial set of conclusions and action steps, along with an explanation of the additional reviews and investigations underway. While fact-gathering is still ongoing, we have not found evidence of intentional wrongdoing by anyone at the IRS or involvement in these matters by anyone outside of the IRS. Furthermore, there is no current evidence of the use of inappropriate screeners or other types of criteria in other IRS operations beyond those discussed in the IG report. We recognize, however, that there is public concern regarding the criteria used for applications for tax-exempt status, and more needs to be done to evaluate our screening criteria and procedures. We will therefore establish a review process by which screening criteria and procedures across the IRS will be periodically assessed to safeguard against any risks of inappropriate criteria. In addition to this important review, I also want to briefly mention some of the actions that we have taken and will take to address the problems we have found. First, we have installed new leadership at all 5 levels of the IRS senior executive managerial chain that had responsibility over the activities identified in the IG report. In addition, we have impaneled an accountability review board to provide recommendations within 60 days and later, if needed, on additional personnel actions that should be taken. Next, immediately upon learning that Be on the Lookout or BOLO lists with inappropriate criteria were still in use, we suspended the use of any such lists in the application process for tax-exempt status. Next, we have established a new voluntary process for certain taxpayers who have been in our backlog for more than 120 days to gain expedited approval to operate as a 501c4 tax-exempt entity. This is a self-certification process which allows them a streamlined path to tax-exempt status if they agree they will operate within defined limits and thresholds of political and social welfare activities. Next, we will establish an enterprise risk management program across the IRS to provide a common framework for capturing, reporting, and addressing risk. This is intended to ensure that such information is brought to the attention of the IRS Commissioner and other IRS leaders and external stakeholders in a timelier manner. Next, we will initiate additional internal and external education and outreach about the role of the National Taxpayer Advocate in assisting taxpayers in resolving problems with the IRS. I also want to point out that our pursuit of broad-based reforms in the IRS does not mean that we believe the specific challenges and concerns identified in the IG report on 501c4s are necessarily present in other parts of the organization. In fact, I believe that any comprehensive review of IRS operations must recognize that the many critical successes that the IRS has had in carrying out its mission over the last several years. The IRS is committed to correcting its mistakes, holding individuals accountable as appropriate, and establishing control elements that will help us mitigate the risks we face. The employees of the IRS are committed to our mission and to operating with integrity and fairness to all. The IRS serves a vital purpose for this country, and we need to earn and maintain the trust of the American people in order to accomplish our mission. We are firmly moving in that direction, and we will continue to report on our progress on a regular basis as we fulfill our commitments. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Levin, that concludes my statement. I would be happy to answer your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Werfel. For the purposes of preparing your report, did you speak to former Commissioner Doug Schulman?
I did not.
Did you speak to former Acting Commissioner Steve Miller?
I did not.
And did you talk with Joseph Grant, the former Deputy Commissioner for TEGE?
No, I did not.
Did you talk with Chief Counsel William Wilkins?
Yes.
What were the basic summaries of those conversations?
As a first matter, there were three things I set out to do, which are in the report. First, understand where the wrongdoing was so I can hold people accountable. Second, understand where the management failures and process mistakes are in the exempt organizations unit so we can fix them. And third, a broader understanding of IRS risks and operations. And I spoke to many people within the IRS. In fact, my whole senior leadership team engaged in an ongoing series of discussions, and Bill Wilkins is one of the senior leaders within IRS.
Did you talk to Sarah Hall Ingram, the former Deputy Commissioner?
I have spoken to Sarah Hall Ingram, yes.
As you prepared the report? For the purposes of preparing the report, did you speak to her?
I'm not sure how to answer that question. I spoke to her as part of my overall understanding of the situation on the ground with the IRS, so yes, I guess they all connect.
Okay, and did you speak with Lois Lerner, the former Director of Exempt Organizations
I did
Division?
not.
Well, I would say that your initial conclusion that the IRS found no evidence of intentional wrongdoing by IRS personnel, given the number of key players that you did not talk to, I think is not necessarily an initial conclusion, but an incomplete one. And I really don't see how you were able to reach that. But we know from our investigation that in the summer of 2011, Lois Lerner directed the Cincinnati office to change the words Tea Party label to advocacy groups. Do you think this was an intentional attempt to cover up the targeting?
I don't know the answer to that question. I think more work needs to be done to evaluate the circumstances.
Again, I find it difficult then to make the conclusion that no evidence of intentional wrongdoing by IRS personnel was done. But after
what I'm suggesting is there's no evidence in the record to suggest that there was an intentional cover-up of any kind.
But you didn't even speak to her.
But each time that I've made the point,
Mr. Werfel, I control the time. And my question is, after she directed this change, Cincinnati intentionally went back to targeting Tea Party groups. Do you know who was responsible for this?
Do I know who was responsible? Well, I challenged the premise of your question.
After the change was made to advocacy groups, the Cincinnati office went back to targeting Tea Party groups. Do you know who was responsible for that activity beginning again?
And we are looking into the facts and circumstances that arose. There's a lot of questions to be asked and answered that haven't been asked and answered yet, and I'm not going to reach a definitive conclusion before the investigation is complete.
If you don't know, it's fine to say you don't know.
Yeah.
I think the answer is you don't know. Do you know who in Washington, D.C. directed the lawyers at the exempt organization's technical office to hold up the Tea Party applications?
I do not know the answer to that question.
Is the IRS interviewing employees who were directly involved with the Tea Party discrimination at this point?
Right now, the IRS is relying on the Justice Department and the Inspector General to conduct those interviews. We're working closely with them, but it's critical that because there's an ongoing criminal investigation, that we do not step in front of the Justice Department and the IG at this time.
Is the IRS conducting any internal document review outside of complying with the requests that Congress has been sending to the agency?
We are conducting a very thorough document review at this time.
Your report also states that there's no evidence of the use of inappropriate criteria in other IRS business unit operations. And how did you reach that conclusion? Are you interviewing employees in these units and requesting information, or is there...
Yeah, there's the major divisions that are involved in these types of activities of dealing directly with taxpayer issues are our small business section, our large business section, TEGE, which is the subject of the audit report, and wage and investment. I've met with the leaders of those operating divisions. We've talked about the issues in the IG report that dealt with the exempt organizations unit. I've asked them to look internally and do their own assessments of any specific evidence they may have of similar problems or challenges in their areas. They've determined that there are not similar, and there's some good reason for that, and in particular I think it's important to point out that in this area of tax-exempt review, it's one of the very few areas within the IRS where the nature of political activity is relevant to any determination that we would make on eligibility or review. And so the other areas of the IRS normally don't involve themselves in political activity. All this said, we understand, and I'm like all of you, very concerned about what is in this IG report. It's a very significant concern. We're hearing from taxpayers that they're concerned, and that's why, out of an abundance of caution, and because it's important to reassure the taxpayers, we're going to review all of our criteria across the entire IRS and report back to you on our findings.
So I think this leads into the statement that in the report that the IRS is digging deeper into the evidence, this is a quote, to determine if there are instances of wrongdoing or inappropriate conduct beyond the mismanagement identified in the original report. So that's beyond the exempt organizations division. Is this, in that process, are you reviewing documents requested by Congress, or is there some other internal review in addition to that?
Well, I think there's a lot of overlap, Mr. Chairman. You have asked, this committee and other committees have asked for an enormous footprint of documents, which is very justifiable, and we are in the process of producing them and have produced a lot of documents for this committee and others. We, as part of our efforts to get to the bottom of this, are looking at a very similar footprint of documents in order to make sure that we understand the causes of these circumstances so that we can take the appropriate accountability steps and corrective action.
Well, I would note we're just beginning to get emails, and so it's not as if we have all the documents at our disposal yet that we're going to need to review. But I have another line of questioning. You acknowledged, and your report acknowledges, that the IRS inappropriately targeted Tea Party groups. And since then, there have been questions raised about whether the IRS was inappropriately targeting progressive groups. And I would like to read to you the Treasury Inspector General's answer to this question, which the minority was kind enough to share with me this morning. Quote, "We reviewed all cases that the IRS identified as potential political cases and did not limit our audit to allegations related to the Tea Party," end quote. So I'd like to repeat that. TIGTA did not limit its audit to just the Tea Party. And let me just read another excerpt from their answer, their written answer, and quote, "From our audit work, we did not find evidence that progressives were used by the IRS to select potential political cases during the 2010 to 2012 timeframe. We found no indication in any materials that progressives was a term used to refer cases for scrutiny for political campaign intervention." So we've conducted interviews with some of the key Cincinnati IRS employees, and they've confirmed that to be true. Does any part of your 30-day report contradict that recent letter and finding by the Inspector General?
No, I don't think any part of our report contradicts it. What our report determines is that there is diversity in the types of political organizations that were accounted for in the BOLO list, and that's all that's in our report.
And the BOLO list is a flagging, and only the conservative Tea Party groups were referred for extra scrutiny. Isn't that correct at this point? That's what we know so far.
I think that's what the evidence points to so far, but as you've mentioned in your opening remarks, we're in the early stages of this, and there's more investigation that needs to be done to answer that very question.
Yes, and the Inspector General is doing a more thorough investigation, but at least in the recent letter he sent us, he said he found no evidence to date, and your report, as you responded, doesn't contradict that. I would ask unanimous consent to place in the record the entire letter that was received on June 26th from the Inspector General regarding this matter. And thank you. I yield to Mr. Levin.
You know, to try to set the stage for some bipartisanship, just quickly, where did you start your government service?
I started my government service in the Office of Management and Budget. I was at the Justice Department for some time. But at the time that this administration came, I was a senior leader in OMB and serving under President Bush.
Your report states, we have not found involvement in these matters, talking about the criteria, by anyone outside of the IRS. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And you stand by that?
Yeah, I stand by it. I mean, I think the statement in the report is appropriately caveated with the point that there are ongoing reviews and investigations that are necessary. But at this time, taxpayers and the public have questions. And to the answer to the question, have you found any evidence of intentional wrongdoing? Our answer is no, we have not.
Your report also says let me just ask you, in terms of the involvement outside of the IRS, have you found any involvement by anybody in the White House?
No, we have not.
There's been reference here to the IG's investigation, and I want everybody to understand in the letter that was sent, there was a bolo that had the word progressives on it. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And you have asked that that bolo and all others no longer be used?
That is correct. We suspended the use of all bolo lists.
The IG letter also indicates, and all of this was indicated for the first time, that there was a number of groups, progressives, involved in the bolo that was sent to a different group within the IRS, and the IG did not talk with anybody regarding what happened to those. So the notion that the selecting out was only as to Tea Party and was not as to progressives is simply incorrect. And when the IG was sitting in your chair, he failed to indicate who the others were. And when asked specifically if it included progressive groups in another committee or subcommittee hearing, he wasn't forthright. So I think he should come back and talk to us and have him ask questions, because in terms of the selecting out process, clearly it involved progressive groups as well as Tea Party groups. That was clear from the pie chart in his report, but he never delineated who the others were, even as later asked. And if he had come forth with that information, I think it would have undercut a lot of the wild innuendos that talk about a White House enemies list, talking about a culture of cover-up. So we want him back. I hope, Mr. Chairman, you will have him come back. And I think, Mr. Werfel, we know that you will encourage the digging out of all the facts as fully as possible as you proceed. Do you give us that pledge?
I do give you that pledge, absolutely.
Thank you.
Actually, Mr. Chairman, there's a question that I answered from you that I think warrants further clarification,
Fine.
if that's okay.
Yes.
And I don't remember your exact question, but I think I want to make sure that I get out early in this hearing so that we have that basis of information to guide the questions, is that where we are right now in our fact gathering, and as you said, it's early, we have evidence, obviously, of diversity of political labels used in the BOLO lists.
Yes.
We have also, as another example of where we have diversity of political labels, This week, we're sending out letters to taxpayers that have been in our backlog for more than 120 days to offer them this option, this fast-track option.
Yes.
There's diversity of political labels in the groups that are getting this letter. And there have also, it's our understanding as we review the facts, that there's a diversity of political labels in those organizations that were put in through process for further review. The challenge that I have in going deeper than that is as follows. To go deeper into those facts could end up with sensitive taxpayer information under 6103. The other challenge is that in looking at the diversity of groups, it's not always clear where they stand on the political spectrum, and frankly, I don't want to know where they stand on the political spectrum. I want the IRS to be in the business of just detecting, because we have to under the law and regulation, the extent of political activity, not knowing the type of politics. But going back to your earlier question, I didn't want to leave the committee with the impression that we're not seeing diversity of political labels across the spectrum. What I'm suggesting is more analysis, significant more analysis is needed before we reach conclusions about what that means in terms of an IRS failure or an IRS issue.
Well, that's why I find it perplexing that you would conclude that there's no evidence of intentional wrongdoing by the IRS when the Inspector General says that he reviewed not only just Tea Party cases but others, and in his letter dated June 26th says that only Tea Party cases at this point were flagged and sent to another review. There were no progressive cases sent to another review.
To a different review.
Please don't interrupt me, Mr. Levin.
Different review.
And so I think that's an important point, and that's why we need the full Inspector General letter in the record. And I think that you might have called these initial conclusions, and I think initial probably should be emphasized. I would call them incomplete, given that we still have more information. With that, I'll recognize Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Werfel, the American people want, need, and deserve to know the truth, and I hope we get it. Mr. Werfel, back in my district, it appears the Allen area patriots have also been a target of the IRS. The bottom line is that the IRS has been used as a political weapon, and that's just outrageous. Mr. Werfel, instead of targeting Americans because of their belief, why doesn't the IRS target fraud and abuse? That is costing hardworking, law-abiding Americans, taxpayers, billions of dollars. Mr. Werfel, I'd like to play a short video clip on an issue that I've been working on for some time now. The clip is from a WTHR-TV investigative report.
I think the public needs to know about this.
And this isn't a single case.
His office has been flooded by illegal workers who have figured out a loophole. It allows them to use their ITIN numbers to get huge refunds from the IRS. The loophole is called the Additional Child Tax Credit. It's meant to help working families who have children living at home. But 13 Investigates has found many undocumented workers claiming the tax credit for kids who live in Mexico. And we're talking lots of kids.
We've seen 10, 12 dependents, most times nieces and nephews, on these tax returns. The more you put on there, the more you get back.
Our whistleblower says he has thousands of examples.
Over the years, the IG has sounded the alarm about fraud and abuse with the $1,000 refundable child tax credit. Do you agree this is a problem, yes or no?
Yeah, I certainly agree that our...
Okay, that's good. Isn't it true that one of the rules to claim the child tax credit is that the child has to live with the tax filer for more than half of the year, yes or no?
That's difficult to confirm that eligibility point, I agree.
Why then isn't the IRS enforcing this residency rule? Mr. Werfel, I hope you will work with us to address this. I've got a bill that would help put a stop to this. In fact, the bill would save taxpayers $24 billion. I want to also ask you about another scandal, and that is the IRS management of the Individual Taxpayer Identification Number Program, or ITIN. Again, why doesn't the IRS target fraud and abuse instead of Americans for their beliefs? Last summer, the IG issued a damning report in which it found that IRS management discouraged IRS workers from detecting fraudulent applications. The IG's report led me to call on the then Commissioner Schulman to resign. On the screen, I've got Figure 6 from the 2012 IG report, showing most frequently used addresses for I-10 tax refunds. As you can see, nearly 24,000 tax refunds totaling $46.4 million were issued to the same address in Atlanta, Georgia. Bottom line, these items, I-10s, are costing taxpayers dearly because they can be used to fraudulently get tax refunds. And last month, the IG issued another report that makes it clear the IRS could be doing a better job protecting taxpayer dollars. Just look at the figure on the screen. Over 1,000 I-10s were assigned to individuals using the same address in Atlanta, Georgia. Do you agree there's still a problem or not? Yes or no?
I do agree there's still a problem. Yeah.
Also, the IG found the IRS workers handling the I-10 applications remain concerned that management will basically pressure them to rubber stamp applications instead of ensuring that only qualified individuals receive. Can you give us assurance that the IRS management won't do this anymore?
I need to look further into that allegation, but on its face, it sounds like something that's inappropriate, and I'll work with the team.
Let me just say in closing, your own report acknowledges the tax code is nearly impossible to administer because it's so complex, and based on the billions in improper payments being made with refundable credits, I'll just say your agency is proving you right every day, and it's time for the IRS to stop targeting Americans and start targeting fraud. I yield back.
All right. Mr. Rangel's recognized.
Welcome to the committee. You said there's diversity in the BOLO list, and you admit that conservative groups were on the BOLO list. Why is it that we don't know whether or not there were progressive groups on the BOLO list?
Well, we do know that the word progressive did appear on a set of BOLO lists. We do know that. When I was articulating the point about diversity, I was trying to capture that the types of political organizations that are on these BOLO lists are wide-ranging. But they do include progressive.
You know, we seem to know what a conservative is, but people, how come progressive now becomes diversity instead of what it is? It's groups that are considered to be liberal as opposed to the Tea Party that's considered to be conservative. Is that correct? Fair?
I think it's fair.
Okay, as long as it's fair, then why are you having a problem with the chairman? Couldn't you say that in determining whether there was abuse of the provisions of the Internal Revenue Code, the staff were looking for signals for organizations, whether they were liberal or whether they were conservative, and the methods they used were not appropriate? Is that a fair statement?
I don't want to jump to a particular conclusion.
Well, what part of that statement gives you a problem?
Well, because where we are right now in our review is we understand that these political labels of varying types were on the BOLO lists. And we understand...
Tea Party is a type, right?
Yes.
Can you give me a type of name that would describe a progressive, democratic, liberal organization?
That's where, I mean, the word, and this is where I reach my conclusion that that there's broad range or diversity in the political groups, because there are some that are more on the obvious side of the spectrum, like Tea Party.
That's good enough for me. You're saying that there are groups that you can say are progressive groups.
I would put them in three categories. There's one that are clearly on the conservative end of the spectrum, some that are clearly on the liberal end of the spectrum, and then there's a set of groups where it's difficult to determine on the facts where they would land on that spectrum, and maybe they don't land anywhere on that. Well, maybe they land right in the middle.
That just makes so much sense. And so far, even though you don't like the technique that was used, you don't find that there was any deliberate political attacks made. It was just that they were trying, based on what you know now, they were trying to do their job and they didn't do it in the right way.
Yeah, my position is that the way in which this should be structured, it should be looking generically at political activity and not using labels that point towards particular political persuasions, because that's inconsistent with the IRS mission statement for how we're supposed to do our work.
Do you think it's possible that the White House would be supporting a targeting of progressive organizations that supported his candidacy?
I don't even want to speculate on that. From my short time at the IRS, I've seen no interaction between the White House and the IRS that would extend to that level. I personally have had no contact with the IRS other than to brief the President on this report.
And could you produce to us the type of names that are on the BOLO list so that we can make determinations as to whether we think they're from the left or the right? Could you help us out with that?
That has been provided to the chairman, given the taxpayer-sensitive nature of the information protected by Section 6103.
So you say the chairman has a list of organizations that were considered to be progressive that were targeted.
What I'm saying is the chairman has been delivered the unredacted version of the BOLO list.
And that list that's unredacted includes organizations that are considered to be progressive.
It includes taxpayer-sensitive information across a broad spectrum of political organizations.
So the chairman knows or should know that the targeting concerned liberal as well as conservative organizations.
That's not a question I feel appropriate I should answer.
But that information was delivered to the chairman.
We've delivered the both redacted and unredacted version of all the BOLO lists to this committee.
And the unredacted includes progressive organizations.
Well, it does, because it's on both the redacted and the unredacted, yes.
Thank you
All right.
so much, Mr.
Time has
Chairman.
expired. And Mr. Rangel, I do want to note for the record that that information is also provided to the Senate Finance Chairman, Mr. Baucus. And you should know that I have also delegated 6103 status to Mr. Levin. So any 6103 information I have, Mr. Levin also has.
Are progressive organizations on that?
Yes. So we are working in a bipartisan way in terms of the sharing of 6103 information.
You don't know how glad I am to hear that, Mr. Chairman. It appeared to be so much confusion before, but at least we know that the abuse was to both type of organizations, conservative as well as so-called progressive. Thank you.
And never wanting to comment too much on the Senate, I believe Mr. Baucus has also shared this information with Mr. Hatch, Senator Hatch. So now I will recognize Mr. Brady.
Mr. Werfel, who initiated the targeting of conservative organizations for extra scrutiny based on their political beliefs?
That question is still subject to further investigation.
Who have you interviewed in the IRS on that matter?
There are a variety of different employees being interviewed by the Inspector General of the Justice Department. I know you're going to make the point that I have not personally interviewed the employees. I understand that.
Because you just testified. You've not interviewed
I have not.
anyone within your agency.
Right, and if it's helpful to the committee, I can explain the structure of my review and
Let's go to
how
the key
we're
question.
uncovering every fact.
Let's go to the key question.
Please.
You don't know who initiated the targeting. Who initiated the targeting of donors to conservative organizations to improperly apply the gift tax to their donations?
Again, the types of questions that were raised to donors,
do you know, I guess is my question.
It's still subject to further investigation. I'm just taking issue with the targeting of donors. I want to make sure that there's no supposition.
Commissioner, please, at this point you haven't interviewed them yet, so you honestly don't know, correct? It's not
a question of that we haven't interviewed. It's a question that the investigation is ongoing.
Who leaked private taxpayer information, including donors, to the National Organization for Marriage, to the Huffington Post, and the Human Rights Campaign? Do you know?
I do not have that information.
Who leaked private taxpayer information for 31 conservative groups to the media, specifically ProPublica? Do you know?
I don't have that information. I will point out that the IG reviewed those circumstances and found those releases of information to be not intentional.
But you don't know who leaked it?
I don't have that information at my fingertips.
Who leaked private tax information to participants at the President's Economic Recovery Advisory Board?
Again, I'd have to learn more about the circumstances of each issue that you're identifying.
Who at the agency in Washington or within the White House was involved in the targeting, delay, and intimidation of applicants on the Be on the Lookout list? Do you know?
That I can answer some of the questions. I will say this. I am not aware of anyone at the White House that was involved in this, or the Treasury Department or otherwise. As I've said, all the evidence that we have points to the involvement of individuals within the IRS, and I'm happy to talk through that with you.
Let's talk through this.
Okay.
In regard to the targeting and delays of the King Street Tea Party True the Vote application, who at the IRS shared private taxpayer information to other federal agencies such as the FBI, ATF, and OSHA?
I believe, based on the question, you've just asked me a question about a specific taxpayer, and I can't answer that question.
Finally, who at the IRS was involved in covering up this pattern of abuse within the agency and concealing it from the public and Congress for the past 2 years?
Again, I don't know that I would be comfortable with the characterizations in the question, but I'm happy to walk through the managerial chain with you and the events as I understand them.
I guess my point is, you're not conducting interviews. You don't know answers to the key questions. Yet, in your report, you declare there is no evidence of intentional wrongdoing or misconduct on the part of IRS personnel. No evidence of intentional wrongdoing. Mr. Woelfel, this report is a sham. I would call it a whitewash, but it's too thin and unsubstantial to even meet that description. And my point to you is that you don't work for the IRS. You work for the American people. Now, your job isn't to cover up, it is to open up this agency, because what we're seeing, these patterns of abuse and intimidation, the only goal appears to be to silence the voice of people whose views you don't like. And so getting to the truth is critical. So my question is, I'm told you're a decent person. So are you serious about getting to the truth?
Absolutely.
Are you serious about
And I'm serious about
restoring the integrity of the IRS?
I'm serious about getting to the truth, and I'm serious about doing it consistent with the rule of law and procedure. And many of the criticisms that you're levying in your set of questions, in order for me to overcome those criticisms, in many cases I'd have to violate that law and rule of procedure.
Let's do this.
So
let's do this.
Okay, go ahead.
Since you're serious, will you commit to returning to the committee in 30 days with more complete answers to the key questions before us?
Absolutely. As these answers become available, I'm ready to submit them. But I think it's very important to understand that in gathering these answers, we have to follow the rule of law and procedures. So the point you're making...
wouldn't it have been great?
Could the witness
IRS
finish in a point of order?
If I can
Mr.
finish.
Brady controls the time.
But let him answer.
Wouldn't it have been terrific?
It is up to Mr. Brady to conduct his questioning as he sees fit.
Wouldn't it have been terrific if the IRS had followed the rule of law and procedures when targeting these conservative groups and donors, leaking their private taxpayer information, concealing it from the public, and then misleading Congress? My question, you need to understand one thing. The Ways and Means Committee is going to get to the truth, good or bad. We're not going to stop until we learn the whole truth. We're going to reveal who initiated these abuses, who participated, who encouraged them, and who concealed them. We're going to hold them accountable, including you, if you hinder this investigation. And then we're going to make sure the IRS never does this again to average taxpayers.
All right, time has expired. Mr. McDermott is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Woelfel, thank you for being willing to be the director of the IRS. After that last set of questions, I think it's important to thank you. You've been at the center of a firestorm, and as has the whole agency. And the IRS has made attempts to address the criticisms and meet the challenges that face us. I've said it before in this committee, but it bears repeating. The IRS has a difficult and almost impossible and thankless job. It's the agency easiest to dislike and easiest to throw under the bus. You go back to the Bible, who do they pick out and talk about? Tax collectors. Remember Zacchaeus? These are the people who were the sort of the bottom of the society. And that's where we're treating IRS people, and I don't believe it's fair. You're hardworking, dedicated civil servants who do your very best to administer the law. Now, I'm going to stop what I was going to say, except to say one thing. I don't think BOLO lists should be thrown out. Every time I get on a United Airlines flight, to go home to Seattle, before it leaves the ground, the first officer leaves the cockpit and goes down with a bolo list. He is on the lookout for a lot of things on that plane. You use it to organize your thinking. The American College of Surgeons has just adopted bolo lists. Before they take somebody into surgery, there's a whole long checklist of things that they look at in anticipation before they put you under anesthesia and do surgery. We think that's the way you organize your thinking. And it's clear to me that a be on the lookout list is a good idea. So don't say you're going to throw them away, because we know that otherwise it become the DMV in Seattle, where you go in to get your driver's license. You take a number and you wait, and you'll have a long line of people because they're not organized. They're taking them one at a time. And if you take 292 or 298 one at a time and don't organize your thinking, it doesn't make any sense. So I want you to be careful about how you reorganize. But I would like you to take the rest of my time to answer the questions that Mr. Brady kept interrupting you on.
I appreciate that, Congressman. The point I was trying to make in response to Mr. Brady's questions was that there are certain procedures that need to be followed in getting the answers that this committee is looking for and the American people are looking for. As an example, clearly the employees involved need to be interviewed, and I am helping to make sure that those employees are interviewed. The issue is that I've been asked by the Justice Department and the Inspector General to enable them to do the interviews, to ask all the thorough questions to get to the bottom of this, because that will make sure that if there is a prosecutorial action that needs to be taken, that it will be clean and the evidence chain will be clean. This is very specific instructions coming from the Justice Department and the Inspector General. So the notion that no witnesses are being interviewed is not accurate. The accurate answer is that witnesses are being interviewed, whether I am personally sitting across the table or not from interviewing. I would love to be able to. But the reality is I'm going to follow the process and the rule of law in getting to the bottom of it. And one of the constraints that I have is that I have to let professional investigators do the interviewing. And that's a constraint I'm willing to live with, because I trust that these professional investigators will be able to get to the bottom of it. One more point about that I want to make about the rule of law and process around accountability. There's going to be a lot of questions and implications that the accountability is not real because people are still at the IRS and they're still getting a paycheck. The reality is that when you take personnel action for discipline against a civil servant, there are rules of procedure that need to be followed. And if I went off and cut off those rules of procedures and fired people and suspended them without pay, then I personally would be violating those rules of laws and procedures. And they're put in place for a reason. Those due process protections are put in place in the event that an employee is unfairly selected for discipline, that they have an opportunity to defend themselves. There's a good reason for them. So when we see things that bother us in government, in particular in the IRS, and we want people held accountable, what we need to focus on is making sure that we're following a very diligent and expedient process in holding those individuals accountable, and that's what we're doing right now. We are pursuing the correct set of disciplinary actions, but we're doing it consistent with laws and regulations that govern our operations.
All right, thank you. Time's expired. Mr. Ryan's recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Werfel, Secretary Lew asked you to put this report together to make sure that nothing like this ever happens again. I look at page 35, and I see basically a case made for a budget increase. Your budget asks for over $1 billion in more spending for your agency, and you're asking us to hire another 4,572 employees. Let me read you what we've already learned in just 2 months. In just 2 months, we've got a conference in Atlanta which had a celebrity chef Wolfgang Puck cater, costing $2.4 million. We've got a conference in Anaheim, California, $4.1 million. A conference in Philadelphia, $2.9 million. A conference in San Diego, $4.1 million. One of these conferences, you had $135,000 for 15 speakers. That's about $9,000 per speaker. The IRS paid for the deputy commissioner to stay 5 nights in the presidential suite at the Hilton Hotel during one of these conferences. You paid $17,000 to a speaker to create paintings of Bono, Michael Jordan, Abraham Lincoln, and others. We hear a report of crony contracting between an improper relationship between an IRS contractor and a person whose business had less than $250,000 in income the prior year is getting awarded a $500 million contract. Between 2010 and 2012, you had 225 conferences costing $49 million. Let me see if I can put this in perspective for you. I represent a town of Sturtevant, Wisconsin. A little less than 7,000 people live there. It's a great village. The village of Sturtevant is basically a blue-collar town. People work at the Case Tractor Factory. They work at the S.E. Johnson Factory. It's surrounded by cornfields and bean fields and lots of small businesses. It took more than 100% of the federal taxes paid by the working families of the village of Sturtevant, Wisconsin, to pay for the 225 conferences you spent at the IRS from 2010 to 2012. That's the way you need to think of this. People are working hard. They're living paycheck to paycheck. They're paying their taxes, and this is what you're spending their taxpayer dollars on? And now you come here asking us for $1 billion, about a 10% increase. You're asking us to hire another 4,500 people. I represent Rock County. That's my home. The population of Rock County and all of the working families in Rock County, their taxes wouldn't even cover the $1 billion increase that you're asking for. You're here representing the president. You're asking us for this increase. I know you're new to the IRS. You come from the Office of Management and Budget, and you have a great reputation. So you're a budget cruncher. How on earth do you think you have the moral authority to ask for this? Why would we, representing the taxpayers we represent, give you all this extra money you are asking for if this is what the IRS is doing with hard-earned taxpayer dollars? We're seeing just in 2 months waste, fraud, abuse, and taxpayer targeting, and you're saying give us another $1 billion. Why should we do that?
Congressman, you're asking very important questions, and I'd love the opportunity to address them. First, I agree. The costs that you're referring to are excessive and in many cases inappropriate and should not have happened. The reports that are coming out that are identifying these are covering events that occurred 2 and 3 years ago. And my concern is great. But my concern would be even greater if I saw that those patterns of spending are continuing through today. In many cases, they are not. We are looking at 68% cut in training travel. We're looking at 45% cut in other travel in the IRS. We've cut our printing by 30%. We've cut our professional and technical services by 25%.
Why don't
there
we
are
put
deep cuts going on
Okay.
in a lot of these activities. Now,
here's my suggestion. Let's have these cuts take place, and then come back to us in a year or two, and let's see if you're running this place well. Then we'll consider a budget increase. How's that sound?
I will say this. It's a fair point. I will say this, that there's more cuts to be made. And I think in this report, in Section 3, and in subsequent testimony that I'll give to this committee, I will furnish for you additional cuts so that we can go even deeper, so that every penny is watched even more closely than it is.
Great. So it sounds like you don't need a budget increase.
No, I'm not saying that, because I think there's a broader macro point. It goes, I think, back to some of the questions that Congressman Johnson was asking. We still have an indispensable mission to enforce the tax code, to go after fraud. The cuts that we are seeing dwarf any kind of conference expenditures that we have. The materiality difference is much different. And we just have to look at this and say, okay, has the IRS done enough to get its shop in order to cut those excessive costs? I'll make the case to you that we're going in the right direction. But I'll also make the case to you that if we underfund other critical priorities that lead to improved taxpayer service and improved enforcement of the tax code, then we're leaving dollars on the table for the American people, because every dollar spent by the IRS has a positive return.
Just don't forget, you work for the taxpayer. It's not the other way around.
Okay. I understand
Time has expired. Mr. Lewis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner, for being here.
Could you tell us how long you've been on this job?
I started...
How many days?
It's been about 34 days.
So all of this stuff just evaporating in the air, it didn't happen on your watch?
No, I arrived in late May, and I'm doing my best to identify the problems and fix them.
Could you tell us something about your background, the last job?
Yeah, so I think, and I've talked about this before in other hearings. I think the reason why I was chosen for this is a couple of different reasons. One, I think, and I appreciate Congressman Ryan's comment that I have a strong reputation. I served in leadership positions in both the Bush and Obama administrations. I consider myself to be nonpartisan. The issues that I've worked on across my career have been very nonpartisan. It's all about better government management, reducing fraud, reducing error, reducing improper payments, improving the way the government manages its real estate. Just very nuts and bolts. I think Ranking Member Levin referred to me as a technocrat, and I've developed an expertise in public sector management over a 16-year career as a civil servant. Most recently, in my role at OMB, I developed a reputation and experience in tackling some of government's toughest challenges. For example, back in 2009, 2010, I was the administration's lead on implementing the Recovery Act, which was a very large and complex law that involved a lot of different technical complexities that needed to be done, and I was the point guard for it and developed a reputation of doing it effectively. More recently, I've been involved in helping the government prepare for government shutdown, helping us deal with the sequester. These are tough public sector management challenges, and I was able to distinguish myself to the administration leadership as someone who can handle a situation like this effectively. So when you combine those factors, and I think the bottom line is that I present, and when I was presented with this opportunity, I basically said, I'll do this, I'm going to do it because I'm going to have this guiding principle that I'm always going to work to find the right answer to every challenge that I'm confronted with. I'm doing what's on the best interest of the taxpayer. I'm doing what's on the best interest of the IRS. And I think if I can hold to those guiding principles, then I'm going to be able to go to sleep every night knowing that this was a smart decision to take this job and take the IRS forward.
Mr. Commissioner, I want to thank you for your willingness to serve, to put yourself in the way and make a contribution to getting the IRS in order. How do you feel about IRS future in processing tax-exempt organizations, applications?
I think we have, when I arrived in late May, we had a very broken process. Clearly, the IG report points to both management and process failures that were going on in that area. There's new leadership in place, and I have a lot of trust in those new leaders. In particular, an individual named Ken Corbin is now running the Exempt Organizations Unit. He's a process expert. He's already inspiring me in a lot of confidence that he is in there working the issue, re-engineering and redesigning the process and making the appropriate fixes. We've agreed to all 9 IG recommendations for how to fix the Exempt Organizations Unit. We're making good progress on that, and that progress is outlined in this report. We're taking steps above and beyond what the IG recommended because we think there's even more to be done to make sure that we are extremely robust in our fixes. Those are also outlined in the report, and we're making good progress there. It's a challenging environment. What I've learned is reviewing these applications for tax-exempt status is difficult because you're on a foundation of ambiguous laws and regulations, and as I said, nowhere, in very few other areas within the IRS is a determination on the nature and extent of political activity a relevant factor to consider. So this part of the IRS has this kind of unique set of requirements, and clearly when you combine those unique set of requirements and management weakness and leadership weakness, we had a failure. But I'm optimistic that we have the right people in place right now, specifically in the Exempt Organizations Unit, in services and enforcement, that are going to lead us to get this problem corrected.
Well, thank you very much, and I look forward to working with you.
Thank you. Mr. Reichert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Werfel, isn't it true that 100% of Tea Party applications were flagged for extra scrutiny?
I think that, yes, the framework from the BOLO. It's my understanding of the way the process worked is if there was Tea Party in the application, it was automatically moved into this area of further review, yes.
Okay, and do you know how many progressive groups were flagged?
I do not have that number.
I do.
Okay.
Our investigation shows that there were 7 flagged. Do you know how many were approved?
I do not have that number at my fingertips.
All of those applications were approved. I want to follow up on some questioning that occurred a little bit earlier in the hearing regarding intent. So I'm an old cop, 33 years. Most of that time I was a homicide investigator. So we dealt a lot with criminal intent. And so when you use the word intentional or unintentional, it sort of is a flag for me to inquire a little bit further. So are you talking about criminal intent? Are you finding that there's no criminal intent, or are you saying that there's no intent to what?
The questions that are being asked by investigators deal with both criminal intent and other types of intent, which, for example, could mean political bias, but no criminal intent. I mean, there's gradations here. I'm not a legal expert on them, but I know that part of the ongoing review is to understand the nature and circumstances of this.
So I also know that there are 2 investigations that occur, just like there were in the sheriff's office when I was the sheriff in Seattle. You have the criminal investigation that's ongoing, and then you have an internal investigation. Sometimes we know the internal investigation is put to the side while the criminal investigation continues on. Are you in contact with those that are conducting the criminal investigation? Are they making you aware of the information that they're finding as far as any possible criminal allegations with any of the employees within the Internal Revenue Service?
My main point of contact in this effort is Russell George, the Inspector General, and his team. He's working directly with the Justice Department. They give us periodic updates on their progress.
Do you have any information that there may be some criminal
None such evidence has been shared with me at this time.
So to get back to the intent part, your report states that some applicants were subjected to overly burdensome, intrusive questions, questionnaires and data requests that went way beyond the acceptable level of fact-finding, but yet at the same time it says that none of the actions taken by the IRS employees were intentional. I don't understand that, how you can ask those questions, provide those questionnaires, asking for certain data, but yet be unintentional in conducting that sort of activity. Tea Party members had a donor had been threatened. Some donors have been threatened. They had confidential information that had been leaked. They were sent inappropriate and intrusive questions. Unintentional threatening of donors. I don't understand unintentional in that light either. And so I sort of am falling in line with what Mr. Brady said, is that the report, I understand your desire to be a public servant, you want to do the right thing, but in order for you to do that, Mr. Werfel, and for the American public to have trust in you and the IRS again, you've got to be, you can't be vague and misleading in your statement that you've given to this committee. You say that even after senior IRS leadership was informed of the inappropriate activities in question, it failed both to effectively put an end to the activity and to inform the proper committees in Congress in a timely fashion, despite requests from Congress on this topic. So I don't understand how your leadership could be found to be unintentional in their not reporting to Congress. Mr. Miller sat here and conveniently lost his memory during his questioning. So could you explain to me unintentional? It makes no sense to me, and I'm sure it makes no sense to the American public.
Let me offer my best explanation. First, I want to go back to the point that we're hearing questions from taxpayers. They want to know if there was intentional wrongdoing here. We're answering that question very carefully and saying there's more work that needs to be done, but right now we don't have evidence.
Mr. Werfel, you really can't say that there was that it was unintentional, is my point.
Let me
you should not be saying in your you should not be saying in your report that you found that this was unintentional, because you don't know. You don't know.
And that's basically what we're
saying.
Is that true? There's no evidence.
You don't know. There's no evidence.
Let me make the point about
the word. Why did you say it was unintentional?
Let me offer.
Now, why did you say it was unintentional when you don't know? You just said you don't know.
I did not say that it was unintentional.
Time has expired, Mr. Werfel. Why don't you answer briefly, and then we'll go on.
Okay, first of all, let me clarify what I said. I said very clearly in the report that more work needs to be done to review documents, to interview folks, but at this point we don't have any evidence of intentional wrongdoing. And what we meant by that is that it's a different situation if a manager thinks and an employee thinks this is the right thing to do, this is how I'm supposed to conduct my business, and they could be mistaken, and they could be incompetent, and it could be total mismanagement in how they think they are appropriately carrying out their duties, which is different than them saying, I know this is wrong, but I'm going to do it anyway because I have a particular agenda in mind. And that's the difference that we're trying to distinguish. I agree.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Time's expired. Mr. Neal's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Werfel, do you need 2 more minutes of my time to pursue?
No, I think I've, thank you for the offer, though. Thank you.
Mr. Werfel, the IG, let me clarify something. The IG letter states that there are at least 2 groups of specialists within the IRS that use the BOLOs. The first is the specialists that are dealt with in the 298 cases flagged for political campaign intervention. The second, it's the team of specialists in the touch and go unit. We know that some of the progressive group applications went to the 298 teams of specialists. The Inspector General did not investigate how the progressives were handled by the touch and go unit. Have you looked into this?
Yeah, we're in the process of looking into when the report says that we start with the audit report and all the various materials that the Inspector General provided us in support of the audit report. We're going deeper than that and broader than that. And that's, for example, how we found the BOLO lists with the inappropriate criteria, because we were going beyond the Inspector General footprint. And of course, when we found them, we put an immediate suspension to them because we were very concerned about them. But and within, when you go deeper and broader into this issue, you see other categories. You mentioned touch and go. And so we're looking into it and trying to understand, how is these lists used? What were the circumstances that caused these inappropriate political labels to occur? How were they used? What impact did it have on taxpayers? These are all questions that we're asking in real time. And like everyone in this committee, I want answers to them, but I'm going to follow an expedient and fair and thorough process to get those answers. And I will be back here to answer those questions in the future.
You're congratulated by members on the other side for the vigor with which you've taken up the task of pursuing these different questions. And then you're accused of not doing follow-up. I mean, there's an element of inconsistency to that as you've tried to figure out how to pursue new information and data as you come across it. Now, the issue really here for all of us is the following. Citizens United caused the IRS to be flooded with applications from groups seeking 501c4 status. And why was that? In large part, it's because super PACs must disclose their donors while 501c4s do not. That's really what happened here. And as we've tried to unearth some of these questions, where members on the Democratic side have been equally vigilant in pursuing what we might deem to be egregious moments with IRS pursuit. But it's obvious as well that you haven't finished your work. And you need to be given some time and opportunity to pursue these cases. We all need to be outraged. The American people shouldn't be afraid of the IRS. We've all established that. But I think the simple point is you would argue you need more time. Is that correct?
Absolutely, we need more time. And my hope today, and in this report, and in every communication I have with the public or the committee, is that there's transparency into the process that we're following. And I want to be clear that the process that we're following has certain legal and process constraints, procedural constraints, but we're moving as expeditiously as we can. We're getting documents to the committee. Witnesses are being interviewed. Materials are being furnished to the Congress. A lot of the questions orient around materials that we provided as part of this growing investigation of information that we provided earlier this week. So absolutely, there's more questions to answer. And I think the track record we're demonstrating here is a diligence to answer them, but also a caution to make sure that we're following the rule of law and procedure in doing so. It's a tough balance because, as I said, I want these answers as quickly as possible, but I have to, and it's absolutely essential that I follow appropriate due process procedures in running this investigation. I think any investigation across a broad spectrum of organizations and leaders and legal investigations would follow those same principles.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, we're all better off if we have an accurate portrayal of precisely what happened, as opposed to the accusatory tone that is being suggested. And you can see, incidentally, that the argument has already shifted here. We've moved to the conferences, which is a legitimate criticism, away from the focal point of this hearing, and that is whether or not political groups were targeted by the IRS. So it occurs to me that perhaps some of the argument is weakening on the other side. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Dr. Bustani.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Werfel.
Thank you.
I agree it's going to take time to get to the bottom of this, but one disagreement I have with you at this point in time with this 30-day report, Mr. Werfel, is I don't see a sense of urgency. The big picture here is that you have an obligation on your shoulders to restore the trust in this entity, the IRS, to restore the trust with the American people and with this Congress. Now, in your report, you have a section titled Transparency with Critical Oversight Organizations, where you talk about the IRS's failure to properly inform Congress about the issues that were occurring, even after congressional committees specifically began asking questions. And we started asking questions years ago on this. But let me get this straight. In Acting Commissioner Miller's June 15th letter to me, after we'd gone back and forth, and I had meetings with Shulman, meetings with Miller, hearings with both of them, and letters. I have a June 15th letter here, and the only response essentially that we got was that EO took steps to coordinate the handling of these cases to ensure consistency. Now, Mr. Brady asked questions earlier, and you told Mr. Brady that you disagreed with the characterization that IRS employees engaged in a cover-up. But if you know the truth on this, I mean, if you know that there were folks in senior positions at IRS who were misleading, evasive, essentially covering up what was going on with targeting, if you know this and you're not coming forward with this, is that a cover-up?
No, and what I said to the congressman earlier was that I'm not ready to draw a conclusion. I mean, he was asking a question in a way that if I answered it, it could imply that I was agreeing with the premise of his question. Your question, is there a cover-up? I don't know the answer to that question. I think the key is that we have to make sure that we do the thorough investigation. I think the Justice Department and the IG
we know
are doing
that Commissioner Shulman and we know that Acting Commissioner Miller were informed of these things, and yet they continue to basically evade our questioning. They were misleading with us. This has been determined so far in the investigation. It's certainly been determined by the TIGTA audit. We need you to have a sense of urgency to come clean. You have an obligation to the American taxpayer and to this Congress to follow through with our oversight function and with transparency in front of the American people.
So the commitments that I'm making today are, one, to explore all the facts, including questions about, intent or concern that you have with respect to why answers weren't questioned more quickly. I'm not going to draw a conclusion now and say we've definitively decided, but let me make one more point. One of the important things in this report is an important point that I think is going to be very helpful to this committee, which what I'm suggesting the IRS needs to do is more readily share information on emerging risk areas and emerging operational issues within the IRS, within this committee, sooner rather than later.
I get that.
Yeah.
I want to shift gears for a moment and talk about the bonuses that have been distributed. It's gotten a lot of press.
Yeah.
And included in these bonuses are, during the time that targeting was occurring, we know that $250,000 were paid out to just 4 employees at the IRS, all of whom resigned or are on administrative leave at this point due to their involvement in the Tea Party discrimination issue. One individual, the first to resign, received more than $83,000 in bonuses on top of his salary of $177,000. Now, and we also know that others have received bonuses who were involved in this tax-exempt issue targeting Tea Party entities. Now, in light of all this, are you going to take any steps to put a freeze on this? Is there going to be an attempt to recoup some of that bonus money?
Well, let me answer the question in a couple of different ways. First, I agree. When you look at the juxtaposition of individual management and judgment failures that went on in this situation, and you juxtapose that against the bonuses received, it's very troubling. And it's part of my larger conclusion here that the IRS leadership did not have timely enough understanding of what was going on with these particular activities to make informed judgments about compensation through bonuses. Secondly, I mentioned earlier to Congressman Ryan about me coming back to this committee with additional ways in which we can cut costs even further, and I think bonuses is an opportunity.
You can put a freeze on it now. Put a freeze on these bonuses.
I'm glad you asked the question because there's been some public misunderstanding about where we stand with our bonuses for this year, and if I could clarify it.
Yeah, but the trust with the American people has been broken. I understand contracts and union contracts and those kinds of things.
If I can explain it, and here's the situation with our bonuses. When I was at OMB, I signed out a policy that froze bonuses across the government in light of sequester. Okay, it was one of our methods of dealing with the sequester cuts was a bonus freeze, but that guidance also said it was subject to legal constraints. So if the bonuses had to be legally paid out, we had to look into that issue.
But the trust has been broken.
Right. What's going on at IRS right now is that we have a union and we have a bargaining unit and an agreement that we will bargain on the question of bonuses with that union. And my answer on bonuses is that there's no decisions been made. Going back to my point about following the rules of law and procedure, I have an obligation before I freeze the bonuses for IRS. If that's the decision that's ultimately made, I don't know at this time. Because my first step in my legal requirement is to bargain that issue with the unions, and that takes time. We're going through that process right now.
Mr. Chairman, we need a sense of urgency with this and leadership to put a freeze on these bonuses.
Time has expired. Mr. Becerra.
Mr. Werfel, thank you very much for being with us, and look forward to having you come back. I think you've mentioned that everything you've stated in your reports and everything that the IRS has done so far to investigate this matter is not yet complete. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
So when you say at this point you have found no evidence of wrongdoing, it's as of this point.
Yes, that's the question we're getting raised, and I feel compelled to give the most honest answer I can, which is exactly the point. More analysis is needed, but at this point in time, if you're asking me, have we found evidence of intentional wrongdoing, we have not, and I understand the confusion around the word intentional because these actions still happen. I tried to explain it's the difference between whether someone knows they're actually doing something wrong or it's a question of a management incompetence or neglect of duty. We certainly have evidence of neglect of duty. What we don't have evidence yet of is that someone knowingly did something wrong based on political animus or criminal intent. That evidence just hasn't materialized yet.
And you use, I think, the operative words, the evidence. So to date, there is no evidence of wrongdoing.
There's no evidence of intentional wrongdoing. There's evidence of managerial wrongdoing.
And to date, there is no evidence linking anything that occurred at the IRS to the White House.
That's correct.
Okay. And as of today, you are still in the process of investigating.
Yes, there's more people to talk to, and in many cases under oath, and there's more documents to review.
And as I think you've tried to make clear, but been interrupted as you try to provide the answer, the reason you haven't spoken to some of the folks that are principal to this investigation is because others have the principal responsibility to do the investigation.
I have two thoughts to this question because it keeps coming up. One is the rule of law, the legal process prohibits me from talking to these employees, the Justice Department, the Inspector General, the appropriate officials. Secondly, even if there was no constraint, we also have professional investigators on the scene that are very skilled in talking to witnesses, and ultimately we might make a decision that those individuals are the ones who should be interviewing the witnesses and providing that information to me.
Well, we want you to be able to continue with that investigation the right way, and we hope that you're able to come back and answer the questions that you can, given the work that you are doing and the jurisdiction you have to provide the answers. But I'd say at this stage what we're hearing from you, in fact, I think what we heard from Mr. Georgie, Inspector General, is that there is an investigation that's ongoing. In fact, the chairman of the committee in his opening statements said that we are still in the early stages of this investigation, that the Inspector General is doing a more thorough investigation. Mr. Brady, my colleague on the Republican side, said, we're not going to stop till we learn the whole truth. So we still need to find out the facts. At this stage, we have a investigation ongoing. It's a half-baked investigation. And to reach any conclusions would mean we've reached half-baked conclusions. And so whether it's your conclusion or my Republican colleagues' conclusion, for anyone to make accusations at this stage, it's with only part of the information.
And there comes the distinction. To answer questions, this is exactly how it happened, is not a question that we can answer yet. But I think we can answer, is there any evidence that any of this has materialized? That's a question we can answer because we're in process, and I can comment on whether the evidence has materialized in any way.
So far, what the evidence tells you is what you're responding to, and we appreciate that. I would say, as much as I would like to have you back, I hope every one of my colleagues on this panel would agree that we have to have Inspector General George back, because he has, as Ricky Ricardo would tell Lucille Ball, he has some explaining to do. There is a lot that he has not yet answered. In fact, there are some things that he answered that may not have been forthcoming. I'd like to finish with one last point. Now, this whole investigation centers around the issue of 501c4 organizations. Now, as you know, 501c4 organizations are social welfare organizations. Under the law, 501c4 applies to organizations that are not organized for profit, but operated exclusively for the promotion of social welfare. I'm not sure if you're aware, Mr. Werfel, but those same 501c4 social welfare organizations spend $256 million on political expenditures in 2012. Did you know that that's more money spent by these social welfare organizations, nonprofits, than the two political parties combined, which spent $255 million? So that's the crux of the problem here, is that we have so-called social welfare organizations that spend more money than the two political parties combined. And so when IRS is concerned that there may be some organizations that are trying to game the system at taxpayer expense, that's why we have to have these investigations. So we hope to have you back. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Roscom.
Thank you. Mr. Werfel, my constituents are afraid of guys like you. They look at this hearing, they listen to you, and I accept at face value that you've got a good reputation from the past, but they look at you and they are afraid. They're afraid of the power that you have. They're afraid of sort of your clinical and somewhat dispassionate approach on this. And I want to walk you through this to recognize the fear that they have because of the power that you have. And my prediction is that our country is at a tipping point right now. And the tipping point is there is an awakening amongst the governed about authority that they have delegated to Congress, and that Congress has delegated in this place to the IRS, and that authority has been abused. So you used language earlier, things like I'm serious, I cling to the rule of law, you know what I mean, those types of things. And frankly, I would expect you to say things like that, and I'd be discouraged not to hear you say things like that. But you're familiar with the Taxpayer Bill of Rights of 1998, I assume, as a general document. It's a statute. And in the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, it's very clear that the Internal Revenue Service is prohibited under the law from willful misuse of provisions of Section 6103 for the purpose of concealing information from a congressional inquiry. You're familiar with that, aren't you?
Yes.
This is a congressional inquiry, clearly. There has been a request by this committee of documents to be forthcoming from the Internal Revenue Service. And here's an example of two of them. They have been redacted to the point of absurdity. Now, we have knowledge that there is information in these two documents that is not subject to 6103 protection. And so the entire Section 6103 question should be set aside. And what I'm suggesting is the fear that animates in the hearts of my constituents when they look at you is they say, we're not getting the straight answer. We're seeing bureaucratic double talk. We're seeing a bunch of nonsense. How can we possibly pierce through this? And so the level of anxiety and the concern that you hear from committee members is a recognition of an abuse of power, but it's a gratuitous abuse of power. Now, even when the investigation comes up, the committee, based on lawful requests, is now not getting the type of answers. So, can you assure us that this type of nonsense, where I know beyond the shadow of a doubt that there is information in these documents that should not be subject to 6103, that the IRS is claiming to an absurd Kafkaesque level that somehow this needs to be protected? Can you assure us, based on your 30 days on the job, that this nonsense will stop?
Let me give you several assurances that you can give to your constituents to clarify. The first assurance I would give is that the information that you're holding in your hand is not being held just by the IRS. We have submitted all the information, minus all those black lines and those redactions, to the chairman of this committee. So the notion and the implication that that information is being held just in the IRS is incorrect.
But Mr. Werfel, you know the law. You know that when it's cloaked in 6103, we're prohibited under the law from revealing that. So you've got to release this information so that it can be publicly discussed. That's exactly what the statute speaks to.
And let me get to my second point, and because I want to address each of those points. I just want to make sure that the public understood that that information resides with this committee and the Senate Finance Committee. The second reassurance is that there's a tension here.
But you didn't answer the question.
We have a
response. To the cloaking of 6103.
I will answer
you are
the question.
You are not releasing the information pursuant to 6103.
I can answer these questions if you enable me.
Okay, go ahead.
I want to make sure that that people understand, your constituents understand the tension that exists, that we also have a solemn responsibility to protect the confidentiality of their taxpayer information, and these procedures are set up. They're set up so that we redact this information, although we send all of it to the chairmen of the Ways and Means and Senate Finance Committee, so it's outside the IRS, and to the extent that there is a notion and a concern that there's over-redaction, and that's something that we need
This is junk. This is junk. This has no meaning.
It might be junk, but it might be sensitive taxpayer information.
It's not. We know it's not. And you're hiding behind it, and I'm telling you, I'm putting you on notice. This committee intends to uphold the 1998 Act, and we're going to follow through on it to make sure that the IRS is forthcoming and not creating a bunch of nonsense hiding behind bureaucratic double talk.
If there is a particular
Time has
instance,
expired.
Okay.
I know at the staff level, Mr. Werfel, we have raised the issue of over-redaction. What it does is limits the ability of the committee to use it. And so I do think this is an issue that is appropriate that Mr. Roscom has raised. And it is something that we probably need to pursue further.
I think so, and I think one thing that should be clarified, given Mr. Congressman Roscom's comments, it's my understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's my understanding that as the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, you can release information if you think that it is not 6103 sensitive.
I cannot unless it's to the full House. And clearly this is an area that we really have to have the experts involved.
Yes, I would agree with
in the
that.
context of a final report, which clearly we're not there yet, I can release the information ultimately to the full House. But I can't be the single arbiter of what 6103 is and what isn't, because obviously Senator Baucus and Senator Hatch received this as well. But we do have concerns that at a staff level there is an over-redaction that limits the ability of the committee to use the information.
And as I've always said,
we've been trying to work through that.
There are concerns, we want to work with you to explore them. But I just wanted to clarify that this information is not just residing within the IRS. That was my main point.
No, it isn't. And we do receive the unredacted versions, but again, then those aren't shared other than with Mr. Levin at this level. So the next person is Mr. Kind. No, Mr. Pascrell. Oh, Mr. Kind is here. I'm sorry.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. I was being blocked by my esteemed colleague here from Connecticut. Mr. Werfel, thank you so much, and thank you for your willingness to assume this very tough duty. I mean, you're obviously, from today's hearing, stepping into the lion's den, and I know you appreciate you have a much larger duty of restoring faith and trust and confidence in the IRS than just the spending that went on with conferences or bonus payments or even the issue before us today, the exempt organizations. But let me steer back to a troubling issue that I've been wrestling with. Obviously, we have many organizations, especially after Citizens United case, that are applying for C4 tax-exempt status. The Inspector General looked into it and recommended the IRS certain steps and procedures on how to review that and how to filter it out. And you probably have some additional ideas. But the point here is that these groups aren't automatically entitled to tax-exempt status. They have to meet certain qualifications, certain criteria in order to qualify for it. And every time there is an organization out there that does qualify for tax-exempt status, that increases the relative tax burden on organizations that don't, or individuals throughout our country that doesn't either. And C4, the rule has been they have to be principally engaged in social welfare. We've gotten away from the more definitive definition of exclusively engaged in social welfare. But how do we move forward now today of doing a proper review of these organizations to ensure that they are qualifying under the C4 definition of social welfare status without being accused of them being picked on or that political selection is taking place? In other words, how do you institute a generically neutral screening process now that's going to pass muster on both sides of the aisle, yet still doing the tough job of screening out those organizations that really ought not be qualifying for tax-exempt status because they're principally engaged in political activity? And we know that's going on. I think anyone here who's fooling themselves and thinking that a lot of these C4 applications are social welfare hasn't seen what's happened over the last couple of years in the American political system.
So we have an approach that begins to answer that question, but I think it needs to be a dialogue between us, the IRS, this committee, and others, and in particular the Treasury Department, I think plays an important role here because at root there's a policy question to be answered. But in the report we outline the self-attestation or certification program. And what we essentially take is our high priority backlog, those that have been in those advocacy cases that have been in our backlog for more than 120 days, and we're offering them a more objective review. And essentially if they attest that not more than 40% of their expenditures or their voluntary person hours will go to political campaign intervention, and at the same time, they also attest that more than 60% of their expenditures and voluntary person hours will go to a social welfare purpose, then they would receive an approval from the IRS and they would go forward with a responsibility to update us if the nature of those activities change, and an understanding, like every other C4 or C3 organization, that they're potentially subject to audit or examination at some point in time in the future.
Well, I just hope we're not going down the road of the IRS being subjected to this type of scrutiny every time tough questions have to be asked in regards to how these organizations are spending their money and what activities they're ultimately engaged in. Because you can understand, you're going to be set up for accusations from here on forth from any group that's receiving more scrutiny or perhaps a denial. And that's one of the more amazing things, is that perhaps there hasn't been more denials of organizations applying for C4 status who are clearly engaged in political activity. And that's their main purpose for being. So is the Taxpayer Advocate's Office, do they have a role in?
Absolutely, and that's a big theme in the report, is that we want to involve the taxpayer advocate more clearly in all of these elements. In particular, and one of the main concerns that I have is that when you look at the situation, we had taxpayers that were frustrated by the length of time that they were not getting an answer from the IRS. They were frustrated by the types of overly burdensome questions they were getting from the IRS, and they did have an avenue, and in many and in most cases, they didn't exercise that avenue to go to the National Taxpayer Advocate to raise greater awareness about the issue. The National Taxpayer Advocate has a track record of helping the public resolve matters before the IRS that the individual taxpayer is having trouble doing on their own. We didn't see that connectivity here, and one of the important recommendations in this report is to raise awareness and the effectiveness of this framework of the National Taxpayer Advocate so we can solve those problems.
Mr. Werfel, you have a tough job as you go forward, and obviously we're going to be looking forward to working with you very closely in your candid investigation and the recommendations before this committee too. We too have a role to play as far as clearing up, I think, a lack of a clear definition as far as C4 applications and that. I think IRS would be helped if there were brighter line rules that for people to institute and more objective criteria that's used, and we'll look forward to hearing your recommendations as we move forward on that front too.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll now be moving 2-1, so Mr. Gerlach and then Dr. Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Werfel, for being here today. My first question is, would you agree that IRS officials disclosing taxpayer information to outside groups or individuals is improper and, in fact, illegal?
It is under Section 6103, yes.
Okay. What is the process if there is an allegation that an IRS official did, in fact, leak taxpayer information to an outside group or individual? What is the internal process, if you can summarize it very quickly, for handling the investigation of that?
Yeah. So what happens is we refer the information or the allegation immediately to the Inspector General. The Inspector General makes one of two conclusions. One, it was intentional, or two, it was not. If it was not, then the next step is to figure out what process breakdown or control breakdown led to the unintentional release. Okay. We have those situations emerge, and we make those process improvements. If the finding is that it was intentional, then it is referred for further investigation, which could be criminal or some other type of disciplinary action.
Okay. Now, Mr. Brady raised the issue of the National Organization for Marriage and the fact that its Form 990 information from 2008 was disclosed and passed on to the Human Rights Campaign. Based upon the testimony that was given at our last hearing here in the committee by the representative from the National Organization for Marriage, what do you know about, at this point, the IRS passing that allegation to the Inspector General's office, and what is the status of that investigation to the best of your knowledge?
I'm two responses. One, I'm not aware specifically of that issue at my fingertips so that I can give you the exact process. Two, I'd be concerned, since you're mentioning a specific taxpayer, that it may be more appropriate for me not to comment in this setting, given it's the implication.
Has, in fact, the IRS passed or referred the matter to the Inspector General's office?
Again, I don't want to comment specifically on this because I just don't have familiarity with that particular issue at my fingertips.
So, to the best of your knowledge, you don't know at this point whether it has or hasn't.
I will say there's, at any given point in time, there's a series of issues in this area that have been passed on to the Inspector General, which are either in process for disciplinary action or in process where it was inadvertent, and we're doing process improvements. Where this particular situation fits in, I don't know, but I can get that information for you.
Okay, if you would respond as soon as you're able to do that, that would be appreciated. I'd like to also ask you, as a follow-up to Mr. Johnson's questions with regard to the amount of money, $46 million of child care tax credit checks that were sent just to the one address in Texas. And in your comment, you mentioned that on the issue of why checks are being sent for this credit, how do you verify that children, in fact, resided at that place of residence for at least 6 months, which is one of the requirements for that? You said it was hard to confirm that a child, in fact, is there for at least 6 months.
Yeah, there's no national childhood residency database, so it's one of the difficult aspects of enforcing that particular eligibility criteria.
So if that's one of the eligibility criteria and you cannot confirm that the child has lived there for at least 6 months, why are you sending out a check?
Well, what happens is that it's not, I didn't say it's impossible to confirm, it's just challenging, and therefore we have a higher degree of errors associated with that eligibility criteria.
So you acknowledge then that the IRS has sent checks to individuals that don't meet the eligibility criteria?
That happens, unfortunately. It's called an improper payment. We have way too many of them in the IRS, and we need to work on that issue.
And so what disciplinary action have you taken as an agency against the individuals that have continued that practice?
I've not taken any, well, first of all, again, arrived in late May. I personally have not taken any disciplinary actions. I'm not sure disciplinary action would be appropriate in all circumstances in that situation.
In other words, individuals within the IRS that have the responsibility over the money that's released by the IRS back to a taxpayer who is sending checks out, in this case $46 million just to one address, not making sure the criteria for the eligibility for that check is confirmed, and still sending the money out. No disciplinary actions been taken against that individual or individuals responsible for that?
Well, we'd have to look further into the issue to see if a disciplinary action is warranted. Look, we make...
Does any disciplinary action get taken in the IRS for anything that's done wrong?
Absolutely, and unfortunately I have...
Can you share the amount of disciplinary actions taken against IRS officials and employees over the past year for improper conduct?
In an aggregate way, yes. In a personal specific way, that's covered by the Privacy Act, and I'd have to do that in another setting, but I can share that information with you, just not with the public.
Okay, well, if you can share that with the committee, I'm sure the committee members would be interested to see when, in fact, a disciplinary action is taken and under what circumstances.
And I will point out that I've been at IRS for a short time. I've already taken a number of disciplinary actions within the IRS, so I know for a fact they do go on, and I have personally been involved in several of them.
Thank you, Mr. Werfel. Appreciate it. Yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Werfel, this far down the panel, it's hard to say welcome, but welcome.
Thank you.
34 days into your challenge, and we appreciate that. I think all this committee is asking, and all the American people are asking, is that you be honest and forthcoming.
Always.
In that light, I would suspect you agree that the IRS process has been broken, would you not?
I would agree with that.
Would you agree that the trust with the American people in the IRS has been violated?
I would agree with that.
Mr. Werfel, the IRS has targeted groups. It has leaked information on donors of groups and then targeted those donors for auditing. This is chilling stuff. As Mr. Roscom said, this is the kind of thing that frightens his constituents. It concerns and frightens my constituents as well. The Chairman asked you if you'd spoken to a number of people in the process of your investigation. Former IRS Commissioner Schulman, you said no. Former acting IRS Commissioner Mr. Miller, you said no. And then Sarah Hall Ingram, you said yes. Who is she?
Sarah Hall Ingram runs the Affordable Care Act operations within the IRS, and I speak to her on an ongoing basis as part of my responsibility to engage with my senior leadership team on the ongoing operations of the IRS.
What was her role during this period of time, during the period of time in the tax-exempt?
It's a good question, and that's one that we're looking at, and I'll do my best to explain it right now. Ms. Ingram was the commissioner of the tax-exempt government entities organization leading into when these events occurred. So the IG report starts to surface issues in and around early, let's say March 2010 is when this fact pattern begins on the IG timeline. It's my understanding that Ms. Ingram served as the commissioner of tax-exempt, government-exempt organizations, which is a level above the exempt organizations unit, and that org chart is in my report. And she served in that capacity until somewhere around the spring or summer of 2010.
So there was an overlap.
So there's an overlap. At that point in time, she moved over and was detailed over to begin her work in running the Affordable Care Act.
Let me ask you why you believe, or why should the American people believe that the trust that's required between the Internal Revenue Service and the American people on the implementation and enforcement of the Affordable Care Act by an individual who was involved in the tax-exempt status entity of the IRS during this time in question. Why should they trust that individual?
Well, what I would ask the American people to do is to trust in the process that we are going through to make sure we're getting to the bottom of this. And with respect
Mr. Werfel, you understand that the process that the IRS has gone through has violated that trust with the American people already, and candidly, my constituents, and I believe the vast majority of the American people, want every individual who is involved in this process to answer the questions prior to being able to have any further trusting situation in their capacity in the Internal Revenue Service. Is that too much to ask?
I think it's valuable input. I think I would like to share what we're doing, which is analyzing for any employee, and Ms. Ingram is no different. We're analyzing what their footprint of responsibility was. And with respect to this individual, there's some complexity in doing that evaluation because she did move over to the Affordable Care Act early on, but at the same time, just in the interest of full candor, while she did move over to the Affordable Care Act within only a few months after this fact pattern begins, her title didn't change, and there's some lack of clarity in terms of her ongoing role within
hence the concern that many of us
right,
have.
so we're looking into that question
to that
very
point,
carefully.
The IRS is the enforcement arm for the ACA. Have guidelines been promulgated for the enforcement of the employer mandate in the IRS?
Not at this time. I think the schedule for the proposed rules is this summer, if I understand your question correctly.
And employers have to comply with this beginning in this fall and in January 1. Have rules been promulgated?
Well, the proposed rules will outline the timing for employer responsibilities.
Have rules been promulgated on part-time, full-time employee distinction?
I don't know that I can
Have
answer
rules
that
been
question.
promulgated on the difference between seasonal workers and part-time workers?
I will give you the full schedule of our ACA rules footprint. I don't have them at
There's
my
a
fingertips.
huge lack of trust in the IRS, and to have the IRS now the enforcement arm over the Affordable Care Act is extremely concerning for those of us on this panel and our constituents. I would urge you to get this information to individuals who will have to comply with all of the rules that you promulgate and make certain that they are true to the letter of your rules as soon as possible.
I understand.
Yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Pascrell.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Werfel, it appears after the time that you've been here this morning that we are not past the point where members of Congress would be speculating about enemies lists, cultures of corruption, and Nixonian conspiracy theories. I mean, if you took the last set of questions to you, first of all, I wonder why in God's name you took this job in the first place at this point in your life. You have a distinguished past, very distinguished past. But if I took the last series of questions, if you want to talk about a conspiracy theory, the person is not even in front of us to ask direct questions to that young lady. Now everything's open. Ask questions about anything. I understand that, but in both sides of the aisle seem to be against, appear to be against singling out any particular groups because of their political thinking. This is what we are opposed to.
Yes.
This is what we're opposed to. So I commend you for standing up, standing tall, and I wish you success in your job. I think you're trying your best. In your report, you announced that in order to deal with the backlog of applications for 501c4 status, the IRS would allow the option for groups to get preliminary approval if they self-certify that they devote more than 60% of their spending and time on things related to social welfare, to go with no more than 40% on political activities. Is there any reason that this is not the existing standard for all 501c4 organizations?
It potentially could be. What we thought would be appropriate was we have a situation with an overdue backlog. We have a situation in which we clearly have had struggles to effectively implement the current regulation of primary. We came up with this self-attestation program because we thought that it would be less burdensome on the taxpayer and still effective in meeting the underlying regulation of primary. But we haven't broadly applied it across all 501c4.
Well, how did you arrive at the 40% in the first place?
Here's what we tried to, keep in mind that the IRS's role here is to implement the laws and regulations as clearly and as effectively as possible. We have this word primary. And so we sat down with it and we said, what is the most plain language understanding of primary that we can defend? And we came up with the conclusion that if you're north of 50%...
Who came up with that?
The IRS. We sat down and we talked through it, and we briefed committees and others on this before we issued it in final. That if your activities are greater than 50%, you're clearly not primary. Okay, if your political intervention is greater than 50%. If you're less than 40%, we would think that you're in a comfortable safe zone of not being in that primary range. Between 40 and 50%, it gets tougher. And therefore, if you're a taxpayer and you believe that your expenditures are somewhere between 40 and 50%, you wouldn't attest. You'd go through the traditional review and we'd take a close look to make sure.
And that's why people apply to you in order to obtain this status.
Yes.
And you determine from what they give you, the information they give you, as to whether or not they're more than 40% involved in whatever political culture there exists.
Essentially, we're trying to figure out what this primary means, and what we're offering with the self-attestation is some inherent structure to how we can think about it.
Now, once that organization receives approval, will they be able to increase their political activities beyond the 40%?
If they,
of their spending and time. That's part of the application.
If they do that, then they are no longer operating under an approval, and they have to alert the IRS that they've changed the nature and extent of their activities.
But they're allowed to continue?
They're allowed to continue, and the reason why they're allowed to continue is because one of the key points here is that you can operate as a 501c4 today without an application. There's two different types of entities that are operating as a 501c4. Those who have an application approved and those that never applied but just file the appropriate forms and operate as a 501c4. If you exceed your 40% after a testing, you just move yourself into that second category where you're operating without an approved application, and you're joining many other 501c4 taxpayers that are doing that today.
So the exemption is very important in terms of revenue. The exemption is more important to decide whether it's more than 40% or less than 40%. And if you go over 40%, you simply have to file a form with the IRS to
let us know.
determine.
Exactly.
So there are, I can assume then in conclusion, other organizations out there that are performing more than 40%. Or maybe more than 50% in the political area and are being exempt from taxes.
I think if they're...
Time's expired, so
okay.
just answer briefly.
I would say if they're performing more than 50%, then my hope would be that we would have an effective exam and audit process that would identify that and to work with the taxpayer to correct it.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Buchanan.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I also want to thank Mr. Wolfer for being here today. I want to recognize also you've been 34 days on the job, and from what it appears, you've had a great background. Let me ask you, because I think you got cut off when you were going to mention, and it's looking at your resume here, they put up here, you manage an agency of 90,000 employees. Your budget's about $11 billion a year. And I think you're asking for additional dollars, and part of the reason you wanted the additional money from the taxpayers is you said $1 investment invested in enforcement or gives you back such a return. What was the numbers you're going to tell us about that? Why you need the additional money?
So we've asked for kind of an increase on our enforcement budget of $412 million. That would yield more than $1.6 billion in annual enforcement revenue, which is a return on investment of $6 return for every $1 invested. And my point was, and I understand the concern about our excessive expenditures that occurred back in 2010 and 2011, and to the extent they're occurring.
Let me just go back, because we only get 5 minutes each. But for every dollar invested, you can get $6 back. Is that what you're saying from
yes,
the taxpayers?
That's what I'm saying.
Now, you've heard this saying, the power to tax is the power to destroy. And I can just tell you that there seems to be a culture, at least from what I've heard, I've been here a little over 6 years, in the IRS, there's a lot more money being put in enforcement, and you can destroy people's lives. I think you've got to understand that. The power, the leverage, the magnitude of the IRS, 90,000 employees, $11 billion in budget. It's not even a level playing field for individuals, and I look at a lot with small businesses. What I'm hearing from my constituents, when you look at you want more money to go after more Americans, is they're very, very concerned because it seems like that's been ramped up in this environment. I'm just telling you what I hear every day.
Yep.
In this environment, $1 trillion deficits, people are feeling like the IRS is a lot more aggressive about coming after organizations, especially small businesses and individuals, because at the end of the day, you can win every time. You can say, well, go to court. Well, you need more CPAs and more lawyers. They run out of money. You never run out of money or resources. So let me, and go ahead, let me answer that if you would.
Well, you're raising an important question, and I'll go back to the report if I could. The report, this question about taxpayer concerns, and we've heard those taxpayer concerns. I think it's notable that in this report, we are candid about organizational and individual failures within the IRS. We're not claiming that nothing went wrong here. We're recognizing that there were significant problems, and we're also recognizing that this represents an opportunity
let me go back
to learn from that.
I just because of our limited time, I want to get that question out. Let me ask you, in terms of yourself, it says you manage 90,000 employees. Is that a correct statement?
I lead an organization that has roughly 90,000 employees.
Who's responsible for the attitudes and the culture and the environment at that organization?
It's a shared responsibility of the leadership team at the IRS and the staff, but I place a lot of importance on the leadership driving.
You're one of the leaders, right?
I'm one of those
I'm just
leaders.
saying, with 34 days, I recognize that. I just want to make sure that you've got a balanced approach going forward, that you don't create an attitude or a climate in the IRS about going after Americans. I'm very concerned that it's more of a balanced approach. There's a sense out there that that's been heightened, not just in the last 3 months, but in the last 5 or 6 years. And there's a sense that we've got to make sure that if you're looking for more money to go after more Americans because you get a 601 return, I'll tell you, you're going to win at every turn. They can't begin to compete with the IRS with the leverage and the power that you have. And that's why it's so important as a leader going forward, and your team of leadership, is that has something that makes some sense, that we're not killing small businesses and as a result killing jobs.
Let me make one final point. In this report, there's a direct commitment to address that question by doing a review across all IRS of the appropriateness of our criteria and our filters and our activities. Hold us accountable for the thoroughness and objectivity of that review, and in the report, we are going to share the results of that with you and with the American people so that we can answer these questions.
But you understand it's not a leveraged playing field, right? You realize if you want to win at the end of the day, you're going to win. And because they run out of money, they'd like to get their day in court or they like to resolve it, but they can't afford what it costs to get their day in court. So I'm just telling you, as someone that's seen that environment and what I hear every day, you've got to be very careful on how you move forward in terms of going after Americans.
All right, thank you. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the Commissioner today.
Who's those are? Are those Charlies?
How long have 501c4s been around?
Oh, I think, I'm not exactly sure, but it's decades.
So they've been around a while. How long do you think an application should reasonably take for approval?
We have a standard of 120 days.
And obviously, many of these cases exceed
Yes,
the 120.
absolutely, and that was unfortunate. It needs to be fixed.
And you've indicated that no intentional wrongdoing has taken place to your knowledge?
Yeah, again, the evidence hasn't surfaced yet, but I would caution that more analysis, review, and investigation is needed.
So that would be an inconclusive finding in terms of the...
Right. In other words, if the taxpayer is going to ask us, has there been any evidence yet, we're going to say, no, not yet, but more needs to be done. So if that could be termed inconclusive, I'm not going to argue with that characterization.
And sifting through the many documents that we've had over the last few weeks, we know that there have been very exhaustive lists of questions asked of applicants. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And we're talking about requesting lists of books read and reports associated, requesting membership lists, volunteer lists, whether or not an applicant intended to run for office or a family member of theirs would run for office. Would you agree that it took a vast number of resources to even come up with those questions?
I don't know how many resources it took, but I would agree that we needed to stop asking a great number of questions that we were asking and revisit and change how we approach our outreach to taxpayers.
Okay, and I appreciate that. It just strikes me as difficult to sort through all of this when we are being asked for more resources for the IRS when it would seem to me that there were some existing resources perhaps that were misappropriated, certainly misapplied as it relates to the overreach in terms of asking applicants the questions. And so moving forward, I would hope that we can accomplish our objective of reducing the complexity of our tax code that I think leads to this very situation in terms of the complexity leading to the misapplication of resources. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Crowley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Werfel, for being here today. After the first hearing on the IRS, which we had in this committee, the chair highlighted and I'll quote, a culture of intimidation. A culture of intimidation. Right. At the time, I think he was referring or hinting that this culture was coming from the White House. A claim that I believe was made without merit or evidence. As the weeks have gone on, we have seen that there is a culture of intimidation, but not from the White House, but rather from my Republican colleagues. We know for a fact that there has been targeting of both Tea Party and progressive groups by the IRS. But this was not divulged by the Treasury IG in his audit of the IRS. The IG didn't even give us a hint that progressive groups were targeted until committee Democrats dug further and deeper into this investigation. My fear is the IG, an appointee of George W. Bush, and a former committee staffer of the Oversight Committee chaired by Darrell Issa, drafted a report that suited Chairman Issa's personal ideology and not the facts of the case. We then saw members of the majority party make baseless claims about a so-called White House enemies list and ideological election year targeting. Again, all false. In fact, we know Congressman Issa knew about the targeting investigation in the summer of 2012, well before the national elections occurred. Does anyone think for a moment that if there was a White House targeting of conservative groups before the 2012 elections, that Chairman Issa wouldn't have said anything about that, that he would have sat back and said nothing about that? Then, as we see, progressive groups were targeted side by side with their Tea Party counterpart groups. The chairman of this committee excused that, in my opinion, both in public releases as well as, again, here today in his opening statement. There's been no outcry by the chairman or my Republican colleagues when progressive groups were also targeted over the past 3 years. I'll point out in this May 21st testimony of Holly Paz, who was interviewed by the committee, both this committee and the Oversight Committee, when she was asked the question concerning the Tea Party investigation and they're being investigated, and did you raise any did it raise any questions with you? And her answer was, and I quote, "No. In the office, you know, it's not uncommon for people to have a shorthand reference to cases by name. And I was aware of, other cases at that time that were working their way through the D.C. office that involved proposed denials of exemption to liberal organizations that supported the Democratic Party. So I had no indication that we were not being balanced in what we were doing." Our committee knew that. Testimony was given, and yet there was no outrage. Just as there was no Republican outrage when the Bush administration targeted Christian churches and the environmental groups and the NAACP between the years of 2002 and 2004 when they were being investigated by the IRS. So yes, I agree that there is a culture of intimidation going on, but it's not by the White House, it's by my Republican colleagues. That is why we demand that the IG be summoned back to this committee to answer questions once again under oath. We also demand that the Republican culture of intimidation stop so progressive groups will feel comfortable testifying before us here. But right now, they are not comfortable coming before this committee. And the chairman's continued silence or excusing of the abuse of progressive groups makes it harder for these groups to come before us. We need to be a committee of facts and not a witch hunt if we plan to get to the bottom of the investigation and hopefully be able to tackle other legislative issues that we have coming before this committee of great importance to the country. So I demand that this Republican culture of intimidation against progressive groups be stopped and that they be as outraged as we were outraged, Democrats were outraged, and we expressed our outrage when groups that we don't agree with politically or ideologically were being attacked or being intimidated or being investigated by the IRS. I would like to see a modicum of a similar outrage by my Republican colleagues for what we held when folks testified before this committee that we don't politically agree with, but we stood by them and said, as Americans, they should not be investigated.
The gentleman's time has expired, and I would just refer the gentleman to my opening statement where I mentioned that progressives were on the Be on the Lookout list or the BOLO list.
Will the chairman yield?
No, I will not yield. And
where was the outrage, Mr.
I will not yield.
Where was the outrage?
I thought you were talking about the sort of modicum of this committee, and yet the gentleman continues to interrupt the chair. You've had your 5 minutes. You referred to me by name as the chairman, and I'm going to respond. And I would refer the gentleman to my opening statement where I mentioned that progressives were on the be on the lookout list, and I made one thing clear, that no taxpayer, regardless of political affiliation, should be unfairly targeted. And with that, I'll yield to Mr. Schock of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin my question, I think I would just say that I think the chairman has been more than accommodating, more than outreaching to the other side. In fact, the chair would indulge when we had our first hearing where we invited witnesses who were victims of targeting. The chair asked for witnesses from the minority. And would the chair remind us how many minority witnesses were submitted?
There were none.
Thank you. Mr. Warfel, welcome.
Thank you.
On page 14 of your report that you've submitted to this committee, you outline a proposal to eliminate the backlog of certain 501c4 applicants that are currently before the IRS. You specifically suggest that to eliminate this backlog, you ask for these 501c4 applicants to certify under penalty of perjury to the IRS that no more than 40% of their expenditures and volunteer hours will go towards political campaign activity, and that the remaining 60% would go to the promotion of social welfare. If that is certified by the 501c4 applicant, it is your policy then that the applicant would be approved in the next 2 weeks.
That's correct.
I'd like to bring your attention to a specific case and ask for how that would fall under this category, specifically the 60-40 rule that you're proposing.
Is this a hypothetical case? Or
no, this is a real live 48-hour-ago case.
Well, I might have difficulty in answering it if it's about a
let's
specific
try.
taxpayer.
On Tuesday, the President unveiled his plan to cut greenhouse gas emissions. Within hours, millions of emails were sent to his re-election campaign supporters through BarackObama.com, the URL owned by Organizing for Action, a 527 organization. Within the email, it asks on its volunteers to, quote, call out via Twitter, email, letters, Facebook, and so on, members of Congress who are so-called, quote, climate change deniers. The action item doesn't just suggest they should educate, but rather that they should call them out. It then links to 85-plus members of Congress that they would like to be targeted, all of whom are Republican, many of whom are on this committee. Under that circumstance, I'm wondering whether or not that activity, those hours, and that money would be classified under the political campaign activity or under the promoting social welfare category.
Well, it's a good question. You're getting into a territory where I'm not the legal expert, but I will do my best to provide some clarity as far as I understand this and the rule of law here. It's my understanding that political campaign intervention has to do with, and I'm answering these questions as a broad matter because I don't want to get into 6103 issues or the specific taxpayer. So I just want to qualify that my answer is in the broad context of how we think about political campaign intervention. That it has to do, and the key issue is, is the entity seeking C4 status attempting to influence the outcome of an election by either supporting a particular candidate or opposing a particular candidate. And the Federal Election Commission has provided guidance to help us on that. And when you have a situation in which, for example, an ad mentions a candidate within 30 days of an election, they say, well, there you go. At that point in time, you have political campaign intervention. But if they mention that candidate 120 days before an election, it's not as clear and more work needs to be done. So to get to your question, I think as a broad matter, one of the first questions I would have in analyzing it, and I think the lawyers who are experts in having that, was, is there a candidate involved, and is the activity intended to influence the outcome of an election?
Well, there's 85 members of Congress specifically targeted.
Well, again, now you're getting into, I don't want to get too specific.
Well, I understand you don't want to get too specific, but the point I'm attempting to make is that the rule you're proposing requires the applicant to make a determination.
Correct.
And so as the commissioner of the IRS who's proposing the rule, under not a hypothetical but a real case situation, if you can't make a determination, how can we then ask a non-attorney, non-IRS commissioner, non-IRS employee to make that same determination under penalty of perjury to classify their activity as either advocating for promoting social welfare or political campaign activity if we're going to limit it under a 60-40 rule.
Right. I was talking at a very general level. There are specific guidance that that we can provide in our application and in the self-attestation. That we ask the taxpayer to look at and determine whether they're meeting the criteria. You know, right now, me articulating it to the taxpayer, it's actually done in much more specificity in the materials that the taxpayer receives in terms of exactly how to answer those questions. I mean, so again, it has to do, the key issue is, are they attempting to influence the outcome of an election? Now, you take it from there and you do further analytics, and then the taxpayer can help determine whether they believe their expenditures will go higher than 40% for those types of activities.
All right, I realize my time has expired. I would just like, if I can, follow up from the IRS on exactly how this new rule would then be enforced, whether it be additional auditing, whether it require additional personnel to enforce, and all of that.
And I can provide for the record the more specific guidance that we give the taxpayer. It was just handed to me, but it might not be in the best interest to read it out loud.
No, I think you can submit it to the committee and we'll make it available. Mr. Paulson's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Werfel, you opened your report with TIGTA's findings that the IRS used inappropriate criteria that identified for review Tea Party and other organizations applying for tax-exempt status based on their names or policy positions. I'm going to ask you this question, though. Were some of the organizations that were targeted for their personal beliefs, were they asked for their donor lists?
I believe it's my understanding that roughly 27 entities were asked for their donor lists, yes.
Do you know if these donor lists were used to target individual donors in the IRS for audits?
I don't have precise information on exactly how that information was used. I think that's part of the ongoing review.
Well, the reason I'm asking this is because part of the report, on page 31 of the enforcement section of the report, it states that all current indications are that this sort of political activity analysis, ambiguity, and subjective utilization of criteria does not occur elsewhere in the IRS. It seems pretty definitive. I mean, how can you be sure that that's the case?
And what I was referring to was, there's 4 main operating divisions within the IRS that deal with tax administration. The one that's the subject of this audit report is the Tax-Exempt Government Entities Organization. The conclusion that's reached in the report is right now in areas, for example, in our Wage and Investment Division, which deals with individual taxpayers, small business, and large business, those areas, we don't have current evidence that the criteria and the screening criteria are inappropriate. We've asked our leaders to look at it. We're going to run a thorough review. And as I said, one of the main reasons why we can be more reassured in that conclusion is that it is very rare outside of this part of IRS that political activity is relevant to any determination.
Well, I would assume that many of these issues should be considered rare to occur in the first place. I know that there's a publication. It's the Declaration of Taxpayer Rights. It was also part of the report you submitted. It states right up front, protection of your rights. IRS employees will explain and protect your rights as a taxpayer throughout your contact with us. The IRS will not disclose to anyone the information you give us except as authorized by law. We know that that has already been violated and that information has been leaked publicly. You have the right to know why we were asking you for the information and how we will use it. We know that that also has not been followed through because these organizations testified before this committee that they asked the IRS why certain information was being asked for, and there was no response for follow-up. And I will just tell you that I also have constituents, many Minnesotans that are in my district who are also very fearful, who have come forward to me concerned that they also have become targets because in recent years of audits that have been stepped up by their accountants, their finance planners, based on their concern that's happening because of their political activity. This has all occurred over the last couple of years, and other members of Congress on this committee and in the entire body have expressed the same concern. Several have told me these personal stories of their accountants telling them, we have never ever, in the history of our experience, we keep the receipts, we keep the books clean, we monitor your activities, we have never had this type of systematic auditing on an individual to this level before. And so we now know that information on individual donors has been collected, we know that information has been leaked, and we know that these audits have intensified on individuals. And I think there's, from my perspective, the report before us has some glaring omissions. That's going to have to be a follow-up report coming down the road. And in the end, what assurance can you give the American people, can you give this committee to making sure that individual taxpayer rights are being protected and there's a plan in place to make sure that that will happen?
Two reactions. One, to the extent, and I probably should have said this earlier to this committee and to the chairman, to the extent there's particular areas in the report and questions that aren't answered, I mean, me, along with the IRS, would be very interested to have that feedback and would commit to exploring those questions with this committee and figuring out the best way to get answers. Our goal with this report was to present a road, was several things. First, to recognize for the taxpayers, part of our reassurance and our path forward is to recognize our failures up front, to recognize that we made fundamental mistakes. There's more questions to be asked about the nature of how those mistakes occurred, but we recognize those mistakes exist. We want to show the American people in this report that we recognize them and we're putting together and actively implementing corrective actions to move forward. We've brought in experts with public sector management to help lead the IRS going forward on these new activities to improve. And some of those activities involve reviewing our current operations to ask the very questions you're answering.
So, Mr. Werfel, let me just ask you this as my time runs out. But there are several employees, and you've described how you have to go through appropriate procedures, but are you seeking the removal right now of Ms. Lerner or any other individuals? And does Congress need to have legislative changes that would allow you to hold these employees accountable so that we can make sure that the trust is restored for the American people?
And if you could just answer briefly.
Yeah, I will answer in two ways. One, with respect to a specific employee, I can inform you of our current actions. I just have to do it in a non-public setting to protect that employee's privacy rights. Secondly, as I said earlier, there are due process procedures in place that are put in place for federal employees with respect to how their discipline or potential removal are handled. I'm not going to comment on whether they're good or bad. I'm saying right now that I'm following the rule of law and moving as aggressively as we can.
Thank you. Ms. Sanchez is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Werfel, I want to appreciate state my appreciation for you being here and answering these questions. I know you've been on the job roughly a month, and I'm sorry, but some of my colleagues seem to be confusing you with the main decision maker at the IRS. So just to clarify a little bit, you're not personally responsible for things like tax refund abuses or conference spending abuses or bonus abuses. That's not your position, is it?
No, I'm here, and I want to stand by my IRS colleagues. I'm here to make sure that any actions that occurred before I got there that need correcting are getting correcting, and that's my role.
Thank you, because I just think you're an easy target. Nobody really likes the IRS, and so it's easy to throw a lot of different issues at you when we're specifically here to talk about the tax-exempt applications and sort of the process that went on there. Now, you're still investigating that matter, right? Your initial 30-day report is not a final report, is that correct?
And there's several entities that have ongoing investigations. Yes, they're still underway.
Including potential criminal investigations, is that not correct?
The Justice Department is actively looking at that as right now.
And I think you've stated numerous times, and people have said that you've seemed a little dispassionate, but there are rules that you need to follow as you investigate these allegations.
I don't feel dispassionate. I feel very concerned, and I think the report has some important language about failures of leadership and management that are very critical. But yes, that concern and that sense of urgency, which I certainly feel, has to be balanced against these procedures that need to take place because they're legally required. And I can't reinforce mistakes that the IRS have made in the past with new mistakes of not following appropriate procedures that are required by law and regulation.
I appreciate that because I have a legal background, and maybe others on the committee don't appreciate that. But I would just like to point out that, Wild West vigilante justice was often swift, but it was not always correct, nor was it always fair. And I think that probably compounding some of the potential failures at the IRS would be mistakes in how the investigation is handled, and if it were to be done hastily and not thoroughly, I don't think that serves the American public.
I would be right back here before this committee answering tough questions of how we didn't handle the investigation fairly. So we're going to do things by the rule of law.
I appreciate that very much. Now, your initial assessment in the preliminary report is that perhaps some inappropriate criteria was used by a group of IRS officials in selecting certain applications for further review. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's our finding, that there were inappropriate criteria used. It's similar to what the IG found.
And if during the course of your continued investigation that assessment were to change, that would be in an updated report, I'm assuming.
Yes, we would, all updates. My hope is that the type of information we garner helps us understand better the nature and circumstances that led to these inappropriate criteria being used.
Thank you. And I very much appreciate in your initial report the identification of certain areas of failures at the IRS and also certain suggestions moving forward in ways that you can make the process a fairer and sort of more transparent one. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about, because it's something that perhaps is little known, your report suggests that the Taxpayer Advocate's Office could have helped exempt organizations that were struggling to have their applications processed by the IRS. Is that correct?
That's correct. There's a critical, the National Taxpayer Advocate can play a very critical role helping a taxpayer who's having trouble resolving their matter before the IRS. They do a very effective job in many situations. I think in looking at this situation in particular, we noted a very small or de minimis amount of contact between the taxpayers, the 501c4 applicants who were receiving unfair, burdensome requests and all the things they went through. There's a lack of connectivity between them and the National Taxpayer Advocate, and that's a lesson learned for us, and we want to try to educate taxpayers better on the avenues they have to help when they're having trouble resolving a matter with the IRS.
And do you think that a broad education project to make people aware of the fact that there even is a taxpayer advocate would be beneficial to these
That's one of our recommendations in the report. We're committed to it.
And now much has been made about the funding and how the funding is spent at the IRS, and there's been a request for additional funding for enforcement. But one thing that I'm hearing from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle is, on the one hand, they want you to enforce these people who are cheating on refunds, and they want you to come down hard on people who are abusing the tax code. But by the same token, they don't want to pay for that. And then on the other hand, too much enforcement pits the little guy against the IRS.
And a quick answer, very brief answer. What I want an opportunity to do before this committee and others is demonstrate two things. One, that the IRS is making real progress in eliminating unnecessary expenses and cutting our budget in areas like travel, conferences, and others. And two, that if we can increase our funding in other critical areas related to enforcement and taxpayer service, that we're going to position the IRS for success in the future.
All right,
thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Marchant.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Werfel, in one of your first days on the job, I wrote a letter addressed to you requesting that you find out the status of a group in my district, the Northeast Tarrant County Tea Party. Is it your representation that over the next week or 2 weeks that this organization will receive its determination?
Let me answer that question very carefully, since you've named a particular taxpayer, and I have to be very cautious. I will lift up your question and say that all taxpayers that are in our priority backlog, who are in this advocacy group that are in the backlog for more than 120 days, will receive a letter from the IRS this week explaining their option to self-certify and get an expedited approval if they're willing to self-certify.
This particular group joined in a lawsuit with the ACLJ. Will that lawsuit have any effect whatsoever on the determination of that group or any group that's inside of that this representative?
Two responses. One, I definitively don't want to comment on the lawsuit. Secondly, I'll just repeat my earlier point. If they're in the backlog, they're getting the letter.
So there will be no retribution for a group that joined in that lawsuit?
It would certainly be the policy of the IRS to not have any type of retribution in those situations. So yes, they will receive, if there's an entity, if there is an entity that's in the backlog, it's our intention to send them this letter. And if they don't receive the letter for whatever reason, then they should immediately reach, and they can reach out to you or whatever, or this committee, or reach out to the National Taxpayer Advocate, and we'll look into it. But again, our intention is to try to get every entity within that backlog, to the extent appropriate, a letter.
On February the 11th, subcommittee that I serve on, chaired by Mr. Bustani, wrote the acting commissioner a request to produce a Star Trek parody video that contained no training content and was produced at taxpayer expense. Subcommittee also asked for the cost of the Star Trek video and any other video produced with IRS resources. 2 months later and three letters later, we had the Star Trek video and the cost estimate in hand. Turned out that that video was produced as entertainment for the famous IRS convention that's mentioned. Imagine the committee's surprise when late on Friday, May 31st, I believe after you had taken over, in an effort to get ahead of the TICTA report, expected the following week, the IRS, about the IRS's lavish spending at this conference. It turned out that this video depicting line dancing and of IRS employees was also produced in the 2010 conference. It was wrong for the IRS not to undertake a good faith search in February for other responsive material, but that was not on your watch. When was the second video brought to your attention?
Very early, I mean, obviously very early in my term. I arrived on May 22nd, May 23rd. It was one of the earlier issues that was raised to me in terms of, it was my understanding that this committee had a request for our videos and we were delivering that.
Did you produce it immediately to the committee?
It's my recollection that once I became aware of it and we had it in hand and it was requested by the committee, we provided it. I think there may have been a need to redact some of the names on it to protect personal privacy, but yes, I think we turned that video over to you very quickly.
And did you or others in the IRS directly consult with the Treasury on how to produce that video to Congress?
How to produce it? I'm not aware of us consulting with the Treasury Department on how to produce it, but I necessarily don't understand your question.
Well, let me follow up. The lack of transparency pertains to just a silly video, and being from Texas, very, very bad line dancing. Now, for something really more consequential, Chairman Bustani wrote then Acting Commissioner Stephen Miller on May 10th to ask about all documents containing the word Tea Party and a list of IRS employees involved in the targeting. You wrote back on June 7th. Did you consult with the Treasury on any of the correspondence that you had with the committee before you responded?
I talked generally to the Treasury Department about our correspondence with the committee to make sure I'm giving them an update on the various requests we're receiving and how we're producing information. I don't have a particular recollection that we talked about this letter.
All right.
But in generally, we do talk about discovery requests that we get from Congress.
All right, thank you. Ms. Black is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Warfel, for being here and helping us to work through this situation. I want to start out by saying that the very basis of any relationship is trust. And we certainly see here that the trust has been broken. There's no doubt about that. I think prior to all of this being revealed over the last several months here, if you'd asked someone what kind of reaction do you have if you get a letter from the IRS, they would have already said, I have fear, they're so powerful that even if I haven't done something intentionally, they're going to come down on me. It's not an organization that helps you work through something if you haven't done it properly. A lot of uncertainty. I can call one day, get one answer, the next day and get another answer. So there was already this image of the IRS with people prior to this. And I think that this is all just confirmed what their feelings were, that there was a distrust and a fear. And restoring this trust is going to be very difficult. And I just wanted to go back and chronicle a couple of things that have been said here, and I'm going to add one to it. You know, obviously we're here for the targeting issue. That's what this hearing was called for. But also we heard Chairman Johnson talk about, and I was on that committee and heard Mr. Miller, I believe, was here the day that we talked about the abuse of the earned income tax credit that results in billions of dollars improperly being sent to people. And there wasn't a concern that we could even work together to fix this. We actually have to bring legislative action to fix it. Chairman Ryan talked about the misuse or the inappropriate use of funds on these activities, over $100 million, which is a significant amount of money, obviously. Chairman Bostani also talked about the bonuses that are being given out to people that perhaps were even involved in this, and we can't be assured that those bonuses are really bonuses that they deserve. I also want to lift up a TIGTA report that showed that 1.7 million recipients received over $2.6 billion of improper payment where we couldn't confirm that they even attended the school that they were asking for the tax credit for on the American Opportunity Tax refund. And so we see over and over again, this is not just about what's happened here in targeting that is a very serious issue, but it's a culture. There's a prevailing culture within this organization that leads people to think when they turn on their television night after night and they continue to see one thing after another, that there is a reason to distrust this organization that has so much power over them. So my question for you is, in your report, you do report here that there were 3 things that you're looking at: accountability, fixing the problem with the tax-exempt status, and then the third area was a broad review of the IRS operations and risk. Are those 3 things only related to what's happening with this tax-exempt, or is this something you're going to look at overall?
It's broader. I mean, if you in Section 3 of the report, what we attempt to do is we draw 4 general conclusions coming out of this issue with respect to the IG report, and we ask questions about the broader applicability of those 4 areas into the rest of the IRS. And we analyze each question and come up with a series of actions intended to deal with the issue. For example, and I think an important one, is the taxpayers that were not getting the appropriate customer service or treatment by being in a backlog too long and getting inappropriate questions.
So I'm going to interrupt you because I'm going to be limited on my time here, and I want to go on to another question. But what I would like to know, I would like to know your plan. And I know you can't give me your whole plan today, but given what we're seeing here, there has got to be a plan to show the American taxpayer they can have confidence that they can trust the IRS in their most personal information.
An initial blueprint of that plan is here and is in Section 3 of this report, and I would love feedback on it. And certainly there's places we can fill out and do more. And I think this report is about starting that dialogue.
I'm going to run out of time here, but I do have one more question. Your report states that you have found no evidence to date that anyone outside the IRS had any role in initiating or encouraging the Tea Party targeting. The question that I have for you is, did you come to this conclusion by asking the White House or the Treasury officials whether they were aware of the activity?
We came to this conclusion by looking at the evidence that we had, which was a variety of documents, emails, employee interviews, a lot of it conducted by the IG in their audit report.
So reclaiming my time, you didn't
essentially, we've looked at the evidence that we have, but we've also said there's more evidence that needs to be looked at.
Okay, so I hope then that you will have a conversation with those in the White House all the way up to the President, and that will be a part of your report that comes back as well. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Commissioner. How are you? And thank you for being here. You know, like a number of other people who have sort of expressed interest in the fact that you would take this position and even asked why, I think I've come to the conclusion of why. I think you know it's a very difficult situation, that you're going to have a tough job restoring trust in the agency by the American people. But I operate from the premise that if there is righteousness in the heart, there's beauty in the character. And listening to you all of this time this morning, I get the impression that that's really where you are, and that's what you really want to do. And that's how you're going to manage this agency in a balanced kind of way, adhering to the policies and practices, procedures, and points of law that have already been established legislatively, that this is what you are supposed to do. I've been tremendously impressed with the report that you have issued, and there are some things that jump out at me. One is the fact that you're ready to make some rectification for those groups and individuals who feel that they've been harmed with unusual delays in the processing of their applications, even to the point of self-certification. So how would that work? How do you propose to have that work?
Well, this week, the taxpayers that are in our priority backlog for more than 120 days will receive a letter that will explain this new program that we have that would enable them to get a fast-track approval if they are willing to certify to these particular facts and realities. And as I've said, it has to do with their expenditures and their voluntary person hours and not to exceed certain thresholds. So if they feel comfortable that they can attest to that's the way they're going to carry out their operations with respect to political and social welfare activity, they will sign the document just like they signed their application today, submit it to the IRS, and we will give them an approval. And if their activities change, they will be required to let us know. And it's possible, like with any taxpayer, that they could be reviewed on audit or exam at some later point. And if we find compliance, we'll move forward. If we find non-compliance, we'll deal with it at that time.
I know that much of our conversation has been about transgressions and activity that was outside the realm of what one would expect. And I also know that history is history, and that it's very difficult to change what has already happened, but it's not impossible to make sure that it does not happen again. You mentioned in your report that there are certain risks that and information relative to operations of the entire agency that the Commissioner's office may not have had enough information about.
Yes.
And that you would want to seriously analyze that. And how do you change that information gap that may exist?
Yeah, when I came to the IRS, I recognized that across the organization, I do not believe today there is enough work being done to both identify, categorize, understand emerging risks and operational challenges within the organization, and bring it together on a portfolio basis across the IRS so that the senior leadership of the IRS can understand those issues and deal with them, not just deal with them, by having transparency into them, it automatically triggers accountability for them to deal with it. It creates an environment in which the leadership and the division itself are working together towards a solution. And very importantly, it enables the leadership to then push that information out earlier in the process to the IRS Oversight Board, to the IG as necessary, to this committee as necessary. We have an architecture that we're putting together, an enterprise-wide risk management program that will redefine the way in which we capture this information and report it up. It seems very textbook within this report, but it's actually very important, and it's potentially, I believe, transformational to getting at some of the root of the very issues that this committee is raising. How can we?
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Young is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner, for being here today. You're certainly entering this organization at a difficult time. Your organization, like all others, is only as effective, only as good as the people that populate it, and by extension, the extent to which we hold people accountable. We have many good, public-spirited, conscientious public servants working in the IRS and other agencies. And we must ensure that we don't put forward any baseless sort of disciplinary actions with respect to these individuals. I know you agree with that. My preference would be to hold these individuals, however, to the same standards that other workers around the country outside of the federal government must pertain to. You have said time and again during this hearing that we need to discover the facts, or some variant of this. First, discover the facts, wait on those facts to emerge, and then take corrective action. Entirely, eminently reasonable, and I agree with that. This would presumably apply to personnel actions as well. We've taken some bold actions over at the IRS with respect to management failures within your agency. Replacing 4 individuals, 5 positions. This is prominently displayed in your plan of action here. And so what I want to know is what specific facts have you collected which justify the replacement of Steve Miller? We'll begin with Mr. Miller.
Okay, as I mentioned earlier, at that level of the organization, we perceived in our review a deficiency in leadership in not understanding earlier in the process the emerging challenges that were happening within the exempt organization unit, the emerging concerns that were being registered by taxpayers. A lot of the activities that were going on in the IG report should have surfaced to the leadership before the IG brought it to their attention.
What did he fail to do? Were there signals that existed that he failed to identify? Did he fail to put in place quality control mechanisms that should have existed? This ought to be documented. You know, I know that throughout our federal government, union protections for your rank and file workers are typically also applied at the higher echelons of management. Yeah. So you had to overcome a pretty high threshold of evidence before the decision was made to replace Steve Miller or any of these other individuals. So I want to know with particularity, why was Steve Miller replaced? Commissioner?
Well, let me first state that I was not at the IRS when this situation happened. That was a decision, I think, that was determined between Mr. Miller, the Secretary of Treasury, and the President on terms of whether the confidence had been lost due to this current situation.
But you're now in charge, so has it been documented? Have the reasons for that decision to replace Mr. Miller been documented? Or could they be articulated by the new commissioner yourself, though you go by a slightly different title?
Yeah, I think this report is in part an attempt to provide a review of what we found in the organization at multiple levels. And I think we talk very explicitly about particular, and I think we identify them as failures within the commissioner's office to, and I think these are the exact words that I think we use, to identify, prevent, correct, and disclose the information that was emerging.
You know, to my constituents, that sounds like a lot of Washington speak. Okay. A lot of words. You're taking up my time here. I've got 5 minutes. I appreciate an answer, but maybe I need to ask the question in a different way. So I'll move to a different individual. How about Joseph Grant? Can you tell me with specificity why Joseph Grant was removed from his position as Acting Commissioner, Tax Exempt and Government Entities Division?
Again, let me take a step back and make sure that I don't violate anyone's rights of privacy. Let me also step back and make sure that I don't impugn any particular individual, because these are organizational layers. These failures were both individual and organizational, and I don't want to necessarily place the holistic blame for the situation on a given individual. There was a collective organizational failure. There were particular individual failures. And I don't think in 25 seconds I can articulate.
Well, I don't either, because you've used the clock here down to the end, and I do appreciate the answers that have been forthcoming. I would like to know, I would like you to report to this committee what disciplinary action beyond replacement of these individuals has been taken.
And we can provide that to you in a different setting.
Right, and perhaps you'll think of or acquire through other means the reasoning behind these separations and communicate those with Congress as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Werfel, because I was thinking along the same way as Mr. Young coming out of the private sector, and I did notice you do have a great deal of concern for the folks that we're asking you to take a look at right now and saying, you don't want to be sure we don't violate any of their rights or privacy. And I think that's very noble. And I think that is your desire. But when I'm back home in Western Pennsylvania, people ask me about, why are they able to do this and why are they able to continue doing these things and nothing happens? Because what I would like to say is, our role as Congress is to be here for the people that we represent, that voted us in office. We're here to I guess then my question would be, we're so concerned about these individuals' rights and privacy, but these folks that were targeted, we don't have the same amount of concern. And for all this idea about my rights, my privacy, all those things seem to be secondhand to an agency that you're running right now. There's over 90,000 people, is that correct?
Yes.
In an $11 billion budget? My goodness, is there any doubt that anything this big and this expensive could possibly be reined in? I don't understand how you're going to do it. I think it's a noble idea, but I don't know that it can be done. And again, moving forward, though, tell me, the people that were let go, what can you do to assure the American people that, or they haven't been, no, they really haven't been let go, have they?
There's a combination of personnel actions that have been taken.
But nobody's been let go.
There's been individuals that have left the organization.
It's an easy answer. Either they were let go or
Has
they
anyone
weren't.
been fired yet as a procedural matter? No.
Right.
But all of these options are being proceeded with
and well, because
appropriate.
the way government works, they usually get redeployed. I haven't seen anybody get let go for anything. And I know that you don't have a lot of tools in your toolbox. When people go on a leave of absence, that's always paid. And I think for the American taxpayers, I'd like to think, you know what, shouldn't somebody be watching our dollars? The answer is you don't have that tool.
People do get fired from the federal government.
I understand that.
It follows a process.
Yeah, well, I understand all that. But as of my 2.5 years here, any of the wrongdoing, nobody's ever been let go. They've been redeployed, they've been repositioned, they've been placed on administrative leave with pay, all different types of things. Both Ms. Lerner and I think it was Mr. Roseberg yesterday, people pleading the fifth when they come before the people's house to answer questions about something that they could be involved in. Now, I know there's a rule of law, I can appreciate that, but that adds then to the public's distrust and loss of faith in the government. So I know you have a large job on your hands. As we go forward, though, you said to start off, and maybe I didn't understand you, but more investigation needs to be done. How long do you foresee this going?
That's a good question, and I don't want to lock into a particular time frame because I want to make sure that we follow the facts wherever they take us. But I would anticipate that that over the next, 2 months, there'll be a material amount of interviews and document review that would enable us to revisit the issues and see where we are. I think that's probably the right complement of time. Will I say it's over at that point? No. But I think that seems to me a good milestone to check in and figure out, have we learned a material amount of information?
So far, what I've seen in your comments is that there's been a lot of wrongdoing or somehow things weren't handled the right way, but nothing that you could say that was intentional.
At this time, we haven't seen anything, but we're open to the fact that it may have occurred. We just want to make sure that we're doing all the right due diligence to ask those questions.
I understand that. Just to switch real quick to Cincinnati.
Yes.
Did it originate in Cincinnati and only happen in Cincinnati? Does it go any deeper? Can you tell that yet?
What I think is important to understand here.
No, I'm really running out of time. Did you notice anything yet?
Here's the point. I need to make this point. The individual that supervised the Cincinnati office sat in Washington, D.C.
I understand, but the answer is no. You don't know yet whether it's just in Cincinnati.
I could offer more than that, but we don't know the answer to. If you wanted me to expound, I could, but
I don't have the time. I would love to have a longer conversation.
I don't know the definitive answer to that question.
Okay. Is there any doubt in your mind that it doesn't lead back farther?
I don't understand that question.
Well, is it just Cincinnati, or does it come back? Does it come towards Washington? How high does it go?
I was about to say that there are people in Washington, D.C., in particular, for example, the position of Director of Rulings and Agreement, which is in my report.
Okay, so it could go much
deeper. That person sits in D.C. Now, there are 5 levels beneath the Commissioner's office, but they are involved in these activities, and their office is in Washington, D.C.
And I appreciate it. I just want to tell you that the people that I represent back in Northwest Pennsylvania do not for any... They don't believe right now that there is going to be a serious inquiry into this, and they don't think that the IRS is going to come out on its own and do it, or the administration is going to do it on its own. It's going to be up to us in Congress to continue to look for what the answers are. So I wish you luck on your job, but I also would say this is critical to the faith and trust that the people have in this government. Right now, their tank's running on zero because we haven't seen anything yet that makes sense to the American people that this is fair and just to them.
All right, Mr. Renacci and then Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Werfel, for being here. You know, I was watching all these questions. It reminded me of the days in my private sector life when I was hired to go into bad situations and turn them around, and that's exactly what you've had to do. And I had to report to a court every week in bankruptcy in those situations as a trustee's representative. So one of the things that people always wanted to know in those was, what are you going to do to change things? How are you going to fix things? And I think those are the line of questions that American people want to hear. They want to hear the answers. I've got a lot of questions, so I'm going to ask you just for yes and no answers, and if you want to go back to them, we can. But did you talk to the Treasury about your testimony and discovery today?
Yeah, I consult with the Treasury about this hearing.
Did you supply them your testimony or submit your testimony before?
My testimony today was the report, so they had the report.
Okay. Did Treasury make any corrections, revisions, or make any suggestions on what you would say or not say or submit today? Yes or no?
I wouldn't say corrections. I mean, I was keeping them informed of how the report was.
Did they make any?
I briefed them, and they offered kind of, I'd say, high-level suggestions. But there were, as an important point, I don't think we got a single line edit from them.
Okay,
so you did general guidance.
Right. So you did discuss with the. You know, Ranking Member Levin said in his opening statement that individuals at the IRS, that targeted groups should be relieved of their duties. I made a quote of that, relieved of their duties. I agree with Mr. Levin. Do you agree with Mr. Levin?
I believe that if there's management neglect or inappropriate conduct, then, and it depends on the nature and extent of the management
neglect. If they targeted groups.
Intentionally, yes, I would agree.
Okay. You have testified several times today that there was no intentional wrongdoing. Was there wrongdoing?
I said there's not evidence yet of intentional wrongdoing, but yes, I would articulate there was wrongdoing. There were neglected.
You testified, like I said, I got a lot of questions, and I don't mean to interrupt you.
Keep going.
You testified that there was neglect of duty. You said that earlier. Do you believe there was neglect of duty?
I do.
So there was wrongdoing, and there was neglected duty, but there was no intentional wrongdoing. Would you agree with that?
There's no evidence yet of intentional wrongdoing, but I'm not going to reach a definitive conclusion until all the evidence is obtained.
Okay. Do you believe targeting of individuals or organizations for political purposes is illegal?
Target with political bias? Yeah, I think there's potential illegality there. It's certainly inconsistent with the IRS mission statement.
Okay. Do you believe it is wrongdoing?
Yes.
Do you believe it is neglect of duty?
Yes.
Did the IRS seek a removal of Mrs. Lerner?
I can't answer that question in this setting, but I can answer that question in a different setting to you directly.
So you can't answer whether she was asked to resign or be fired?
Not in this setting, but in a separate setting I can.
What is Mrs. Lerner doing right now?
I can't answer that question in this setting.
Do you believe the IRS, again, I'm going to go back, do you believe that IRS employees who are deemed to have targeted someone for political purposes should be fired?
If it was based on political animus or that type of intent, yes. If the seriousness of the management neglect was to the appropriate level of seriousness, then yes.
Are you aware of Section 1203 of the IRS Restructuring and Reform Act of 1998?
We're aware of the act, but you'd have to tell me exactly which section you're referring to.
Section creates a list of 10 deadly sins that the IRS employees can be terminated for.
Yes.
Are you aware that political targeting is on that or not on it?
I don't have the list memorized, but I can look into it. I think it's implied through other more general criteria. Is my recollection.
It's specifically not mentioned. Can you think of any reason why we should not add the targeting of an individual for political purposes by the IRS agent to that list?
Given these events, I think it's a reasonable suggestion.
Okay. Well, I agree, and that's so you know I'll be introducing language to do that, and I hope your agency will support that. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Griffin is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Werfel, for being here. I also have heard great things about your
reputation, and I hope that you will get to the bottom of this. I want to raise some specific questions, though. This report, Charting a Path Forward at the IRS, is a public report. And in this town, as you know, you've been here a while, and I've spent some time in this town, a public report, whether it's intended to be or not, is a political report. People are going to seize upon what's in that report, and they're going to statements like the one that you made, we have not found evidence of intentional wrongdoing on behalf of IRS personnel. They're going to seize on statements like that, and they're going to hold that up and say, see there? No evidence. I was a staff investigator here in the House. I've been a prosecutor. Did you not know that by putting that in the statement, you were communicating to the world, even though this is simply an update, you were communicating to the world from a political perspective that there is no evidence of wrongdoing. I understand factually what you mean, but the reason this has gotten so much attention is because what a responsible investigator would say is either nothing where that line exists or the investigation continues. The idea that you would say there's no evidence of intentional wrongdoing at this point is, I worked at the White House in political affairs, you've worked at the White House, I worked up here. That's a political statement. Whether you intended it to be or not, that's a political statement that whether you mean it to or not, gives cover to people politically at a time when Lois Lerner pled the Fifth Amendment, where anybody who's gone to YouTube and seen the testimony of high-level IRS officials in front of this committee, based on what we know now, it's clear that they were not being forthright and telling the whole truth with this committee. Now, whether that constitutes what you would call evidence or not, if I knew that one of my top lieutenants had just pled the Fifth and my other lieutenants had given less than the whole truth to this committee, and I saw a staff person write that sentence, if they did, I would take it out. My first question is, did you write that sentence or did a staff member write that sentence?
There was a group of people. I was one of the authors. We co-authored it amongst a group of people. I'll take ownership over every sentence in this document. If you allow me the opportunity, I can respond to some of your points, but I don't want to use your time.
Okay,
it's up to you.
I know. I'd love to have a lot more time than I do. And maybe because I'm last, I can keep going. Maybe not. But did the White House at any time, I know the White House, as I used to say, and probably you say, is not a person. Did anyone at the White House review this statement?
No.
No one?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Anyone at Treasury?
Yes.
Yes. Well,
and let me just say, I did brief the President a few hours before the report went out. On the morning the report was issued on Monday, and I did mention this conclusion. So I just wanted to make sure that that was clear.
I appreciate you pointing that out. I think the bottom line is here, we have an ongoing investigation here in this committee. We have an ongoing investigation in the Senate. We have an ongoing investigation at another committee. We have a criminal investigation. We have a top lieutenant who has pled the Fifth Amendment. We have, in my view, we have video of high-level officials giving less than the whole truth to this committee, which is potentially a criminal act. I just think that whether you believe that statement or not, putting it in here with your background in Washington is irresponsible. And let me go on to the next point here. These individuals that you personally did not interview, Josh Grant, Stephen Miller, Doug Shulman, Lois Lerner, can you tell me Who is interviewing? First of all, is someone interviewing them?
The Inspector General and the Justice Department are putting together a witness list, or have put together a witness list. I assume it's evolving based on the facts that they're gathering, and the professional investigators of both the Inspector General and the Justice Department are conducting those interviews, and at the appropriate time will share those results with me, and I assume you, in order to make sure that we have a collective understanding of the facts.
All right. Thank you. Time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Werfel, for your testimony this morning, and with that, this hearing is now adjourned.
Oh, all right.
Can you tell me how you expect to get some